I'm Liam Ryan. I'm the Chief Innovation and Planning Officer for the EirGrid Group. And we have almost 200 people on the call this morning on the virtual forum, which we are taking you through shaping our electricity future, which was launched on the 8th of March last. And it has landed really well from the initial engagements we've had within the industry, but today is really taking you through the shaping so that we can actually hear your voice as we actually move forward in relation to how we actually shape the electricity future into the future. I'm pleased to say that it's landed really well, as I said a few moments ago. And I'll shortly hand you over to the panel, which will take you through in more detail the various different dimensions that we focused on, from the networks, the markets, and the future operations of the power system. And you'll see that I'm joined here this morning by John O'Sullivan, Robbie Ahern, and Owen Kennedy, and they will take you through the various different items as we work our way through it. But before I hand over to the panel, I just want to set a little bit of context before we move into that area. And it's really appropriate today to be talking to you on this webinar, as today is Earth Day 2021. And the premise for Earth Day is we need to build back a better and build back a more sustainable and a green future, if you like, as we emerge from the pandemic. So I think this is a real appropriate forum today that we're actually talking about. So if we go to the next slide, Killian. We're extremely fortunate in Ireland that we have a government that have set very strong and ambitious targets where at least 70% of our electricity will come from renewable sources by 2030. And that gives us that direction of travel that we need to deliver by 2030. And this can only be achieved by all of us working in collaboration together to get behind those targets and deliver them in an innovative and collaborative manner. And like, I'm really confident that we can do it. And what gives me that confidence is that when I look back over the last 15 to 20 years of our industry, we've connected on a significant amount of renewables onto the system. We are currently operating the power system at 70% SNSP, where 70% of our instantaneous electricity is coming from renewable sources. And last year, we achieved over 40% of our electricity coming from renewable sources. And that's a huge achievement from where we actually came from. The next adventure will be a challenging, will be more difficult to do it. But today we'll take you through how we, as EirGrid, see a path actually to be doing that. And also the other things which gives me real confidence is when I look at the achieving the targets that we've actually achieved. We are world leading, and people are coming to us and looking to Ireland on how Ireland has done what we've actually done over the last number of years. And we're even pushing the boundary further. And I'm happy to say in the not too distant future, in the coming weeks, if not earlier, we'll be moving to trial at 75% SNSP. And it's a huge, again, another groundbreaking step forward, built on the DS3 program and the participation of all the people on this call over the last period in time. Killian, if we go to the next slide, please. So clean electricity is going to drive the climate action plan. And what we actually, the ask of the electricity industry is that we reduce the carbon footprint, or the amount of carbon that we're consuming, by 7.5 million tons per annum. And that's a significant reduction. But then if we actually think about the electricity system is going to be asked to assist the sister industries. It's going to be asked, and we know it's going to be asked, through the electrification of heat and transport, the transport, and also the building sector, and also the industry sector, to help decarbonizing those areas. And that's going to drive the demand in the electricity industry. And we're seeing that demand, and we expect the demand to grow in some scenarios up to 50%. So electricity is key in relation to meeting the targets that are in the climate action plan. And we know that there's going to be a new version of that coming out in the not too distant future. And I expect it'll probably be more ambitious than what we have here in front of us. But we're currently planning for those targets, and the 70% renewables target is really key for actually delivering that target. Killian, if you could go to the next slide, please. So we in EirGrid are about supporting our policymakers to find that balance that we need to actually do. And we are we know that finding that solution is really critical. And what do I mean by balance? I mean that we have to do this in a very secure, reliable fashion. That our end consumers and those who consume electricity have come to expect a reliability that we need to maintain as we're doing this really ambitious transformation over the next period in time. And therefore, as we do the transformation, or as we make that transformation, we know and believe that the natural gas is going to be that important transition fuel. That needs to be there at times when the renewable industry or the wind isn't blowing, and the output from solar is less than the demand that we actually need. So we see that as a support and a key element to what we actually need out to 2030 and beyond it, indeed. And we also know that we need to achieve this balanced approach. We need a collaborative approach to let us move on and to develop the systems that we actually need. We cannot do this on our own, and EirGrid cannot do this on our own. We need the whole ecosystem, as we've proven as an ecosystem that we did it for hitting the 40% targets in the past. Killian, if you go to the next slide, please. So in EirGrid, we're actually looking at this, and Owen, Jono, and Robbie will take you through this in a bit more detail in the rest of the work later on today. We know we must change what we're doing at the moment, where we need to change how we operate and how we run the markets and how the markets incentivize energy, the consumption of energy, and also the generation of energy into the future. We also know that we need to change how we operate the transmission system. We will need to be able to operate the transmission system more flexibly than what we actually have up until now. And we will need to look at other system services to help us move along that journey. But look, the guys picked that up early. And then we also need to change how we actually, the network that we need. And we need to modernize our network so that we're utilizing as much of the existing grid as we possibly can. And minimizing the amount of new builds that we can, because we know that's been a challenge in the past. But to make all of that actually happen, we know that we have to win the hearts and minds of the communities outside. Killian, if you could go to the next slide. And what I mean by the winning the hearts and minds, I'm really talking about everybody within the ecosystem working together, from the politicians to the suppliers of electricity, to the regulators, to the government departments, and to EirGrid itself, and to our colleagues in ESB at both the transmission system operator and as the distribution system operator. And we all have a key part to play as we're actually moving forward in that. And key around that will be that we work collaboratively on innovative approaches to achieving the 70% target as we transition to the new paradigm into the future. And EirGrid only holds one seat at this table. And we are here today to give our views and to listen to what our industry partners are telling us, so that we can revise our plan and shape it to meet the future needs that we actually need. Killian, if we could go to the next slide, please. In this context, we, as I said at the beginning, we have launched the consultation on the 8th of March last. And we, at the heart of this is that it's open, it's transparent, and we want to get the voice of as many stakeholders in the engagement as we possibly can, because we know that this is going to be a significant transformation for all of us and for our society as well. And therefore, I'm not going to talk through everybody on the list here, but we are working with partners in all the various different areas to make sure that we're reaching out to probably the more harder areas of our society to get their feedback in. And we're working with the likes of Irish Rural Link to host workshops and communities for communities across the island, across Ireland. And we're also working with Chambers Ireland to host workshops for business across Ireland as well. And we've had a number of those in recent times. And as late as last night, we had a National Youth Council of Ireland, and to host a youth assembly for the future electricity consumers, because we need to hear all the voices as we're actually working our way through it. And of course, we're hosting in the industry forum today to get your views in relation to how we shape our electricity into the future. And again, later on, we'll be hosting civic society forums, and we'll also be hosting public forums like the Citizens Assembly run by the government to get the broadest input that we possibly can in relation to how we get to a future roadmap, which we're hoping to launch in the autumn timeframe. So really, this is an engagement across all of society, across industry, and across all key influencers. And this is probably the largest consultation that EirGrid has ever done in the history of our organization. And it's a genuine attempt to really hear the voices of everybody as we actually shape our electricity into the future. Killian, if we go to the next slide, please. So this is on this slide is really kind of how we would ask people to, or we'd encourage you to take part in the consultation. And during the session, you'll hear in-depth insights from my colleagues to help you to formulate your deliberations and your input into ourselves. And therefore, we would really ask if you could give your consultation through the mediums we actually have outlined here. Our consultation is open until the 14th of June, so we're roughly about halfway through. And therefore, we have some time for yourself to get the inputs into the help us shape our future deliberations. Killian, if you have the next slide, please. So turning to today, which is the real meat of what we want to talk about today, it's really, I've pretty much gone through the introduction, and I will be handing over shortly to John O'Sullivan to take us through the electricity market and how the future electricity market is going to be shaped. Then we'll actually have a break at 10:30. And again, we will then move on to looking at system operations, and Owen will take us through that. And then we'll have at the end of each of the sessions, we will have a Q&A session, so that it gives people the opportunity to pick and choose which sessions you may want to come in and out of. We will try to hold to the times here so that we're not starting early or finishing early. We may finish a little bit early, but we won't be starting early, because we want to make sure that some people may be coming in at scheduled times throughout the day. And then the final presentation will be from Robbie Ahern, and Robbie will take us through the transmission network, the future transmission network. and we've put in 2 breaks because we know, look, there's probably a lot to get through this morning, and we want to make sure that we're giving you the opportunity to have breaks as we work our way through it. Killian, if you go to the next slide, please. I just want to take a minute to run through some of the housekeeping. We've designed the webinar so you are given time to the Q&As, as I've actually said, after each presentation. And you can submit the Q&As through the Q&A tool, which is you should be able to see on the bottom of your screen. And all participants should be able to submit the queries, and we will ask people, so you will have the opportunity to upvote on any questions, or you can add your comments to the questions, and then we will try to answer as many questions as we possibly can through the Q&A session. But we know that not all questions will be answered, and we intend to respond to all questions in due course. Now, it may take us a little bit of time depending on the scale, but we will be doing it in a timely fashion to make sure that we're responding to your queries and comments as we actually work our way through it. And just for those who took the opportunity to submit questions to us in advance, these questions will be posted by the team during the session. So when we go into the market, if there's specific questions on the market, we will post those at the very beginning of the market, so everybody can see those questions as we're working our way through. And just a reminder that the webinar is being recorded by EirGrid so that we have a record of the event, and in particular that the questions and how those questions actually come in. But it'll be only the panel that will be visible and be recorded. And for clarity, participants will not be visible and therefore not recorded, but your name will be seen if you submit a question. And I just wanted to bring that to everybody's attention. And you know, we are dealing with complex issues, so it's important that as we work our way through it, that you have the opportunity to raise the questions, and the panel will respond at the end of each of the presentations. And it's now like where I've covered the various different elements that I wanted to cover in relation to my introduction. Again, it's an absolute pleasure to have everybody here this morning, and as we work our way through it, and I'm happy to take if there's any initial questions at this point, because I'm just running slightly ahead before I hand over to John. If there isn't any, I'll hand over to John in about 5 minutes. Okay, I don't see any questions coming in at this point. So at this point, I will hand over to Jono. And John, if you want to take the market session.
Thanks, my name, just for introduction, really, I'm John O'Sullivan. I've been head of what we are now calling Future Markets, and I want to take you through the market vision for the SOF. Just a little bit of background. There may be people on this call who don't know who EirGrid are, and so I've been in EirGrid effectively for the last 25 years. I've worked in operations, planning, and markets, and I was heavily involved in both the STEM, the original STEM program, the original, and also.
Sorry, John. I think your voice is coming in and out. I don't know if the tech folks can help us.
Any better?
Yes, John.
Right, we'll try without that. So, what I want to talk about, why we actually call it markets, is rather than markets, that as we go through the decades, I think it's increasingly becoming recognized around the world, that the energy market is not going to be sufficient to get us to where we need to get us
Sorry, John, you're having the same kind of issues. We might just take a 2-minute break or a few minutes break here for a second, just to see if we can sort it out. Thanks for your patience, folks. Again, as questions actually come in, you have the opportunity to upvote on those questions, or even add your own comments, and then we will pick up those questions will be put to the panel as we actually move out into the Q&A session. You're just on mute, John. So just while John is coming back online, I'll wait. I won't kick into the market element yet, but over the last number of weeks, we have had, as I said, a number of consultations and engagements with the industry, with some of the
Liam?
business elements. Yes, John?
Liam, yeah, I'm in on the phone. Apologies. Can you hear me there?
Yes, we can, John.
Hopefully that's clear. So I think I'm okay. I'm in on the phone. Killian, I'll run. I don't have access to the video. I can't see the video at this point in time, but I'll just talk you through the slides. I'm on the market slide, and if we continue from there, and I'll say next slide, and I'll talk you through so we stay synced. Just okay, folks. Apologies there. My name's John O'Sullivan. I was just giving you a bit of a potted history of who I am. We've set up future markets to really look at, it's not just about the energy market, it's about a broader set of that. The work that we did, we took an approach to go and analyze all of those markets against the principles on which they were designed at the point in time. We reviewed that in our work, and what we saw is generally those markets have delivered on the essence of why they were designed. But when you look at where we are trying to get to, both in Ireland and Northern Ireland by 2030 and beyond, there are real issues that mean that some of the markets are conflicting with each other, and or they are not actually going to drive the necessary investment in an affordable or timely fashion. And then when we look at, we strip it down into conceptual principles of how markets can work better, and you get into quite funky situations, particularly in the high renewables. We go through some of them. So we come up with some principal arguments of how the markets might be evolved, and some practical changes that we think. And then the last thing we put it all together is in a roadmap, as we do in all the pillars of the SEOF package, to come up with a roadmap. So that's great principle. How do we turn that into a practical implementation? And we talk about that. So that's ultimately what I want to talk about today. Next slide, Killian. So the first thing for those, again, just to introduce EirGrid Group more generally, we're not a generator company. It's not for us to build generation or wind farms, but we do operate the day-to-day power system, and the evolution of that technically is hugely challenging, and on we'll go into some of the technical challenges of that and the network. All the markets I'm talking about are either ultimately governed by regulators or policymakers, and so to the extent EirGrid Group, we are not the decision makers on the things that we are talking about, particularly in markets. We are the competent authority with respect to the secure needs of the power system of both Ireland and Northern Ireland, and we can certainly have a view of what is technical scarcities are there that are causing us material issues. But ultimately, it has to be said that everything we're talking about here in this markets vision will be subject to some form of regulatory consultation and approval. And we want to work with the industry and the regulators and the DSOs in those practices, and also where possible, particularly in supports with the policymakers. So that's but where classically, I think energy markets and around the world have focused on, it's all about competition and price. I think there is a realization, and I think certainly with our approach to 2020, I think we recognize it here too, before many other places, that the resilience of the electricity system as you go to more renewables, particularly with more non-synchronous technologies like wind and solar and storage on the system, actually you change the very fabric of the system. That's not to say you can't make it resilient. It's just to say that it is a challenge and you need to address it in line with adding or becoming more renewable. And consulting with the electricity sector on all of these matters is critical. There's no way, as I say, we are not the decision makers on this, the regulators are. A lot of the stuff we'll be talking will impact multiple actors on the system, including distribution system operators, and it impacts investors in the system, third-party investors, and it affects consumers. So that's why consulting on this is necessary, but the time is moving on. We have to move quickly. In a general sense, I think I have a little narrative story that I think sort of will go to the heart of the issue. I think I've talked to a lot of people in recent months, and I said, look, if your bill today was £2,000 or £2,000 a year or €2,000 a year, and it's largely fossil fuel, say 60% fossil fuel, and very resilient, and I could promise you in 10 years' time, for €2,000, all your electricity needs, as resilient as it is today, are reliable and fully wind and solar, would you take the deal? And most people say yes, they'd take that deal. And some people say, actually, I want it for cheaper. If I then say to them, well, if it was €4,000 and as reliable, would you take the deal? And most people will say, no, I won't take the deal for that. Or if I said it's €2,000 and as reliable, or half as reliable as we have today, would you take the deal? Most people would say they won't. And so the only paradigm that society wants, the willingness to pay, is keep the affordability of my electricity the same, but also keep the resilience. I don't want to be annoyed. I don't really care what challenges wind brings for you or whether there's a lightning strike or a generator maintenance. I don't want to know. I just want my electricity to live my life. And it's really about, I couldn't care about energy. I care about my lifestyle. And the issue then, if you see on that then, is what is an energy market with wind and solar, all wind and solar? And actually the marginal price or marginal cost in that market becomes zero. Now, we get an argument of, is there carbon in there? And we can certainly have some discussion in the debates on that. But in that world, the energy market is saying zero, yet we have a willingness to pay from society of however many million homes between Ireland and Northern Ireland, 2.5 million households willing to pay €2,000. So there's something missing. There's something gone awry here, that society, as long as you keep it affordable and resilient, they're more than happy to go to renewables, but the energy market in itself isn't going to drive it there. And when you might think this is an academic exercise, but for us, it's actually a real exercise, and one that we are seeing way before everyone else. So, Killian, if you go to the next slide, hopefully you should see it in front of you there, transforming the system for the future. If you look at where we're at the moment in 2020, we have about 5,000 megawatts of installed wind, mainly onshore. For 2030, in and around 15,000 megawatts will be needed, and for 2040, maybe above 20,000 megawatts. So we're looking at an annual renewable production of about 40% annually and 70% by 2030. And who knows, by 2040, it could be greater than 90%. But ultimately, what we're seeing is that by the end of the decade, 2030, we're operating today, and Liam touched on it, we just started trialing 75%, which in itself is pioneering. There is no other power system, synchronous area in the world operating up to these limits. So ERCOT is about 50%, Great Britain is about 50%, Australia is about 50%. We're at 75% in the context of our system. Tasmania I can talk about as well if people want to bring that one in. But we're aiming effectively for 100% equivalent by 2030. Yes, we say 95%. There might be 5% from hydro and biomass. But in general speaking, we're really going for, can you operate a synchronous area with non-synchronous technology up to by 2030? This concept of curtailment, once we're up there, it's probably better to be called market redispatch down for will largely have to be zero. But there is an issue of oversupply there. And that's really where we go by 2030 and 2040. If we have more wind than at times the system needs or the demand needs on the island of Ireland and Northern Ireland, if we're not exporting it, how are we going to use it? And that's really want to put that. So this is the challenge for us, and there's no point in stopping at 2030 as some of the questions is. So if we go to the next slide, Killian, and if you just stop it for a second there. So what you should have in front of you here is the duration of all island wind penetration. And the purple curve there is effectively the 2018 actual availability of wind on the system and how often we operated up to, as it was, 65% to get a total annual output of 30% energy. So these are hour by hour, the 3,600 hours of the year. We stack it up and said, well, actually, for about 600 hours of the year in 2018, we were above 50% SNSP. But we never got to 75% because we weren't operating that. And that allowed us to get to 30% output. What we did in this basic thing, we basically scaled it. We scaled it to 70% annual output. And then we asked our question, and what we actually see is for about 1,000 hours of the year in 2030, we will have more wind than the total demand of the system. Now, we may be able to export some of that, but we'll have more wind. So fundamentally, the energy market might be coming up with a price of zero or negative. And on top of that, operationally, OWN's going to work out, we're not just at 70% or 75%. Do we have to be up at 100% there? Otherwise, we're wasting some of that wind. It's being redispatched down. And for 1,500 hours of the years, so, you know, not quite half, 45% of the hours of the year, we're above 75% SNSP. So we're fundamentally nearly more hours above 75% SNSP, where we've never operated before, no one in the world has. And do the markets and the operational practice that has been really established over the last 100 years stack up in that world? And largely the SEOF is saying, no, it doesn't. And you need to do things to manage that. And I want to talk about the financial implications for that through this one, and on we'll talk about the operation. And linking us all is, if there is a network, there's a problem. So, Killian, if you just go on to the next one where we start seeing when you have capabilities. If you look at the low wind area, you know, the hours that we've very little wind on the system, generally our reserves have been got from conventional plant. They're the marginal plant, we part load them, it's been fine. And that's classically how we've operated. But as we next slide touch, as we move up the food chain in more reels, we're dispatching off the conventional. So the reserves that we get, which largely will be broadly the same dimension, but may be needed to be quicker. So you know, we're probably still going to need 400 or 500 megawatts of fast-acting reserves. The source of those reserves has to fundamentally change, because if we're getting them all from conventional plant, the chances are we are not going to be meeting the renewable targets. But similarly, we've got to be confident that those reserves will be delivered in a way that's meaningful to maintain the resilience of the power system. If we hit another one, then we should see electromagnetism. Now, this is really critical to AC power systems. And fundamentally, for 2030, we're looking at a situation where we probably classically have never even worried about it, that we had so much conventional plant, we had more than enough electromagnetism, but it was all coming from our conventional plant. If we hit the next one, Killian, if you then start to take that conventional plant off the system, how we maintain enough electromagnetism so all the things that we thought would work still work becomes really important. And that is going to be a challenge in that. And I can talk about the recent paper from the regulators at a later stage. Then if you go on and we see this thing called ramping, and what we're really saying, when we were a conventional plant, all system over to the right-hand side, we didn't really worry about ramping. We just got it as an inherent part of conventional plant where we're dealing with, had a reasonable technical capability in grid codes. You put it all together and it seemed to work. But as we become a more weather-dependent system, what we're seeing is if we have 5,500 megawatts of wind and there's a forecast delay of 2-3 hours, you could be down 600-700 megawatts on what you expected because of a forecast error. That's the kind of thing that we were trying to cover in ramping in the DS3 program. But obviously, as we go from 5,000 megawatts installed up to 15,000 megawatts, that ramping becomes much more critical. And if we go to the next slide, we then also have to ask ourselves a fundamental question about adequacy. And the nature of the adequacy challenge for our power system changes. And so at some point in the future, we can't be just always reliant on conventional plant to provide adequacy, but nor can we really do the transition without making sure that we keep the needs of the system at the forefront. So in any innovation, you can't just say, I'm going to innovate and drop the ball on what I'm doing. We need to segue away from the reliance on conventional plant to some other technologies that are much more in line with the renewable future. But we can't do that with 3 or 4 blackouts. That's just not acceptable. So the nature of adequacy and how we incentivize it in the medium to long term is really critical. And we've also, if you hit the slide, we've also got to look at a range of other issues, such as 5-day. What do we do when there's no wind on the system for a week and it's very cold? What do we do when there's no gas? If we've got our basic system is gas and wind, and what is the concept of dual fuel? All of these things come into that. But maybe we should be incentivizing certain on risk assessments of, well, the system won't be able to cover unless we have enough backup generation for a 5-day wind event where we demand. And when you go above 100% of the system, not only do you have to operate at 100% system, there's a fundamental question about, well, who should pay for the wind if it can't be utilized in the electricity system? And that gets you into investment decisions. The wind farm is going to have to be paid for today, but who's getting the benefit in the short term and the long term? Right? So the investor can't make his money if he's waiting for 28 years to work it out. But similarly, the electricity consumer, if there's more wind for, say, 30% of the hours of the year that can't be utilized, who should pay for it? And that discussion is really in how you, not only an energy market discussion, but it's also a support discussion we get into. I'm running through all of this, and Robbie will touch certainly on the network aspects of what we need. But we're moving from a 30 terawatt system to about 50 terawatt system by the end of the decade. That's a 40% increase in demand. And so across all of this, if we can't build the network that we want in the time frame we want, or we're building just enough network to make sure it works, the concept of congestion, and we're beginning to see it with data centers in Dublin, and some of the LCCs in the capacity market are very binding and actually creating effectively answers to solve not just adequacy but network issues. And we see that in Northern Ireland, and we see it in the Dublin constraints that are in the capacity market. That fundamentally congestion is something we're going to have to deal with, and how we deal that financially is critical to how people are going to make investments. Thanks, Gillian. So if we go to the next slide, so that's the high level thing. So those are the issues we need to try to solve. That sort of imbues everything that Owen is going to be talking about. And Robbie is touching on a lot of that because he also has the network issue to build out those assets. But at the highest level, if you look at the sort of money that we're talking about over the decade, and we've done some preliminary studies that we're getting validated, but in general, you're talking in the order of about 40 billion euros investment across the decade in Ireland and Northern Ireland to drive third-party investment, right? And obviously, if there is in some way the investor doesn't know where the risks are for their projects, they're going to bid in higher returns. And if they say they're going to deliver something and we're relying on, and they don't deliver, there needs to be some credible threat of enforcement. Otherwise, we get bad behaviours, and ultimately those bad behaviours either undermine us reaching the targets, or de facto they go to the affordability of the transition. But not only do we need the right investments in the right places, we need them in the right time, because the wind farms and the renewables are coming through renewable supports and their gated processes. So there's about 3,000 megawatts of additional wind and solar to be added to the system by about 24, 25. And do we have the operational capability to deal with that in that time frame? Discuss, right? And then that goes to really, if we get the right investment and its timeliness, is it affordable? And the affordability goes back to that sort of little vignette at the start, that really we need to make sure there's not unnecessarily duplication of costs or conflicts in the markets, because that will hurt affordability. And that's really where we get to. And that's what I want to touch on in this next slide. So the markets that we're talking about, really, yes, it's the energy market, but it's also the capacity and system services markets, and it's also res supports, tariffs, res corporate PPAs. All of these things go to markets. On top of that, you got to look at network costs and juice, but they're relatively small in the overall thing, and that's something that we're not talking about in this market vision. But these are where we see the drivers of it. And effectively what we did in the SEOF was we examined these markets as they are today and asked ourselves, do they fit together for tomorrow? And generally speaking, we found some issues when we did that. But as I said, the markets generally were delivering reasonably okay for the principles in which they were designed. But maybe now with the higher renewables, you have to think about some of those principles. Next slide. So when we looked at it, what we really saw, and it's generally the EU model and the UK model, and that this is a standard model, that look, a lot of that, the European ideology is coming about its energy-only markets will work, and with a bit of res supports. And basically, our analysis over the last decade, and certainly over the last 2 years to support the SEOF, says there's a range of technical issues that aren't being addressed in that type of energy market. There's a range of investment scarcities for the right capabilities to manage the issues that we see. And we just don't think in installed energy-only market works. And indeed, I think that's becoming reflective in Europe even, because I see them beginning to put in price caps into the balancing markets and stuff that would have been anthem to let's say, the neoliberal design principles of Europe. What we really need to do is that if we get to the ability to be able to operate at 100% SNSP, then actually a lot of the ideology on energy markets actually works. But if you can't physically operate up at 100% and your market's flooded with, say, wind farms, there is a disconnect, a distortion between what the energy market's saying and what you're physically running to. And that causes inefficiencies and causes skewness in investments, which actually go to affordability and go to effectiveness of investment. And that's a lot what we're doing. We also got to recommend, though, and recognize, should I say, that we really need to be maintaining proactive long-term integration, both with the United Kingdom, or the SEM-GB, and the SEM and Europe. You know, you're not going to do energy security in an isolated fashion. So the EIRGrid Group certainly sees that. So how we manage Brexit in the short term is critical to the first stepping stone in this journey over the decade, which hopefully I get to. So if we go to the next slide, what we see here really is, you know, Europe are our partners, but there's a range of things that Europe in theory wants us to do. If you look across the pantheon of us, a lot of it because of Brexit in the grey, we can't participate in now because Brexit has effectively taken us out of the day-ahead markets. We're not coupled up yet in the balancing platforms. We should be really green on the left-hand side for everything if Brexit didn't happen. By the end of the decade, and certainly when we recouple with Celtic, the SEM market, we're probably going to need to be fully compliant and fully active in all those markets. And how do we move from there, from where we are to there? And a lot of it is about, and we've had some early discussions with the regulators and CRU and the European Commission. They're fully cognizant of the challenges that Brexit has put in place. They're fully open to looking at when certain regulations are applicable to us. And I think it's about reprogramming that as an industry, putting this down in the next 6 months as a reprogram, get that program agreed and then deliver on it. But a large part to the right-hand side is we need to think about how we're going to be in the balancing platforms of Europe when Celtic comes in, and I'll talk about that at a later stage. In the shorter term, it's making sure that we're on top of the CGM and feeding the European integration beast, doing something in LV, pragmatic in LVC, although that's a challenge because we've less influence in the European UK trade on the SEM-GB border. It's a European answer as opposed to a SEM answer, and that's something that I think there's a workshop next week on. And that's why we need to reprogram this in our work in markets more generally, because if we don't, we'll end up with building a market that can't integrate with Europe, and that's a big challenge. Next slide, Killian. So in driving investment, the one thing that I really want to bring out, we want to bring out here is what is absolutely critical. Investors have, in our view, two types of risks: the risks that they can control themselves and the risks that they can't control. And to the extent we can't use a capability that somebody invests in and puts a capability X in the system, who should pay for it is a real issue that needs to be clear. And to the extent it's a risk that's outside the investor's control, in general, that risk needs to move initially from the investor, but over time to the consumer through the TSO. So what do I mean by this is, if we have a situation where somebody says they invest in, let's say, a storage plant for the want of a discussion, and on the basis that if we're operating up at 100% SNSP, or that we have the network built out the way we said we'd build it out, that they get their money, and then we turn up and we don't build the network out, or we can't operate up to 100%, then, and the investor doesn't get their money, there is a real issue there. I don't think the investor can make the investment in that thing. But that's not to say that the investor should just be covered from the start, because the balance of risk between the investor and the consumer is key. The investor has information when they invest, where they invest, and they have clarity of what the issues are. We are certainly putting in a program to try and address the constraints and the redispatch down as best as we can, and reach very pioneering levels, or very ambitious 95% SNSP. But at some level, if we don't quite meet that, we're going to have to make sure that the investor who made a reasonable investment at the time is covered for that risk at the appropriate time. And I'm not saying where it is, and I think that's going to come out in discussions, but if the mechanisms that we put in place don't recognize that risk and don't have a mechanism for dealing with it, it simply won't be able to drive the investment required to solve the problems. So this principle of usability is just massive, and it imbues our view across all the markets when we're looking at them, if that makes sense. If we go to the next slide, Killian. Market principles then, really, what we saw when we saw the challenges, when the energy market was sort of delivered for trading purposes with Europe, the capacity market was really, can we keep the capacity that we have open, more or less? It's certainly run into some challenges in recent years on getting new investment. So what we really want, and system services are designed for 2020, 40% renewables, and not designed for 70%. So what we're really trying to say, look, the market should be trying to be aligned to the operational needs in getting to 70%. And to the extent the markets aren't, you're going to have things that are actually fighting against each other. And that's something that we say, how do you actually change the design if you need to? That's one thing. Commitment is really trying to cover that principle of usability. And if there isn't a commitment, a financial commitment at a point in time, that the risk for those risks outside the control of the investor, like redispatch down and network, if they do not move from the investor to the consumer at a point in time in a balanced way, we will either not get the investment, or we will not achieve the affordability in that situation. The clarity then is, in all of this, you can do all of these things, but if it's not clear what the risk is, if it's not clear what the product is, if it's not clear what the incentive is and the money return, the investor can't make their risk. So to the extent there is ambiguity, that ambiguity needs to be removed. And that's really the three principles when we looked at all the markets, and to how we try and address that, combined with the issues we identified earlier. So we go to the next slide, but are our markets delivering for 70-30, and we look against investment timeliness and affordability. What we really see is that the energy market, at some level, is no longer driving investment. It's an exit signal, right? Because it's becoming more volatile and the prices are largely trending down in it. And that's an issue, because really you would have thought that the energy market was the major driving component, certainly in the target model from Europe. Capacity has certainly had good successes in keeping conventional plant open for adequacy reasons, but I think there's some clear signs of issues in the capacity market. It's not getting the new investment. It's certainly, and I think the regulators are looking at this too, and we would certainly, I think we've got to look at how we're really incentivizing future performance, how we're modeling future performance. I note that of the 5,000 megawatts of wind that we currently have, it's seen as a 500 megawatt requirement in capacity, that it gives us a benefit of 5, yet they don't get paid. And somebody say, yes, but John, that's the support structure of wind. We don't want duplication. But to the extent we got 70% of our renewables, our system coming from wind by 2030, do we really think the market is well designed if 15,000 megawatts of wind, which might give us a 2,500 megawatt benefit in capacity, doesn't get or isn't required to seek money from the capacity market? And I think, we could go into DSU storage and a range of things as well, but that's where we're saying, look, there are definitely issues there. And also state aid has to be reviewed by 27, and that's an issue. Supports and corporate PPAs, the supports really are a policymaker thing, but to the extent they obviate discipline, market discipline, that's a concern for 2030. And so I think you can have supports that don't obviate market discipline, particularly system services and capacity, by 2030. And I think you also have to see how we're dealing with the oversupply, who should pay for it. Because if the electricity consumer is paying for it, the PSO levy goes up more, and the regulator, who's obligated to look at the cost of the consumer, may be saying that going up. So while they may approve the support costs, they may not approve the monies for other investments such as system services. And so that is a concern. If the oversupply is material, who should pay for it? Because the wind farms need to know that before they make their investment. And system services is a major revamp. I would certainly say it, for those who know that I was heavily involved in DS3, I think system services to 2020 was a real success story. And I think it really did deliver, but it was only designed to meet 40% by 2020. It was price regulation. It cannot deliver the technical needs for 2030. And on top of that, we need to move to something that's more volume regulation, because Europe wants it, but it's also more efficient. And we're certainly in that. And a lot of this will also have to be done with the DSOs in mind, because a lot of the capability we see both in capacity and system services in the longer term, medium to longer term, has to come from the demand, and the demand is invariably on the distribution network. So this is generally where we go. If we go to the next slide, Killian. Specifically in energy markets, I can get into a little bit more detail, energy capacity and system services, but in general, we're going to have to deal with the post-Brexit issue and do something pragmatic. We'll talk about that in more detail, but Europe wants multi-regional loose volume coupling at the moment, or the TCA says that the cost-benefit analysis that's just been done on it would say there's issues for LDC, particularly in the GB European model. So there is some question about will it be LDC at all. That's a political discussion at the specialised committee, but we need to understand that quick, because we probably need a single solution in the SEM GB aligned to GB Europe by the time Celtic comes in, and the quicker we have that in, that has to be done. I think the existing roadmap, certainly out to past 2022, that's there, the market roadmap, we really need to question it, given the things we're talking about here and a couple of the big issues that have to be dealt with, because we really need to start focusing on 2030 and things that matter, because there's a lot of work to be done. We are going to have to significantly enhance across energy and all the markets, the IT systems to do the processing, and I'll touch about that in the end. But longer term, and I'm talking probably by 24, 25, we need as an industry to have a real discussion when Celtic comes in, how are we going to participate in the balancing markets in Europe? And that may require a consideration of the central and self-dispatch models, and it may require a discussion of ex-ante pricing. I'm not saying it has to, but there's a real fundamental. Europe has gone down the world where, to me anyway, the balancing markets don't give you system services. They price energy closer to real time. That's fine. But our market is really an ex-post imbalance price market determined market. And that, while it was allowed at the time, it is certainly non-standard for Europe and creates a lot of challenges about balancing when we're in the balancing platform. So those are the things in that space. On the big one as well in the wholesale energy market is aligning in some way the ex-ante market to operational capability in some way, and that's largely coming out of the consultation on Article 12 and 13 in the electricity regulation. But ultimately, if we're not aligning the energy market to, in some way, SNSP limitations, we are going to get distortions in the energy market that saying this is the market answer, which are system services deficient. We don't have enough system services to run that energy market. And we then have to interfere both in the energy market, but that has ramifications for the capacity market, renewable support system services. The more we interfere with those, we're increasing the cost in those markets. And you need to look at the totality to say what is the answer. And that is that effectively issue has been fully discussed and consulted by the regulators. And I believe there's another consultation due in the next week or two from the CNC on that. If we move over to capacity markets, Killian, should be capacity markets, align the capacity market to high-res world. So really, a lot of what we do at the moment, we have limited capability to model new technologies because of how we model it. We need to move to a platform plexus where we can model those better. I think a lot of it, the performance, and I think the regulators and the UR, Paul Bell, is my understanding, is considering, which I would generally agree with the sentiment and the concept. Look, why are we saying the derating is based on historic performance rather than some estimate of future performance? And I think that's about, can we look at incentivizing, allowing choice of performance in the future, but putting in stricter market discipline. If they don't deliver, there's real penalties, or there's a real incentive for non-delivery against that. I would note there's a few projects haven't been able to complete in the capacity market, and you have to look at maybe it's the discipline. But I also think around capacity, it's very clear that we've got to move it away from being a support to conventional plant to being what I would call a service, a capacity service. And to the extent it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, you need to pay it like a duck. We need to look at the net cone calculation and stuff like that. We're not saying we want to duplicate, but to the extent some plant, because they get more money in system services, get less money in capacity against other plants, really means that's not right, because it's undermining the investment. You're just trading one off, and that's something that needs to be. Now, what can we tweak in the coming year, and it's probably the next year to be of any benefit, is going to be a question, because we're going to have a full review, because we need state aid approval post 2027. And so I think from a practical consideration, we need to really decide now what we're going to do it for the next couple of years and see if it helps. But the real discussion comes in 2027. What do we have post 2027? And that discussion should really kick off in 24, 25, in line with the balancing discussion. If we go to system services, next slide, Killian, then we're talking about, look, we need to move the procurement. We really need to move the design of system services, instead of being for 40% renewables to 70% renewables. We will be certainly strongly advocating moving it from a price regulation approach to a volume regulation approach, which generally is more efficient. We decided to do price regulation for 2020 to speed up investment at the time, and I would stand over. I thought it was the right answer then. I certainly wouldn't think it's necessarily the right answer now, and it's in line with European answers. We're going to have to do it. We need to look at the services that we need to solve, the problems we need to solve. Owen will certainly talk about some of those, but in general, it's not just the 14 products. In fact, some of the 14 products we have may not be as important for 2030. They were for 2020, and now we need to look at other ones, but definitely congestions in there, potential frequency regulation products need to come in, as well as maintaining reserves. We're definitely going to have to do something on electromagnetism, even though we have a synchronous inertial response product. And to the extent we would like to do all of this through auctions, I think certainly we're behind where we need to be on getting the high level design of future arrangements up and running, our system services. And so I think to progress and keep things on track to solve it, we're definitely, and we support the CNC's request to look at fixed term contracts for effectively electromagnetism products. And I think that's a good thing, and we hopefully will be doing something on that in the coming months. We do need to have the high level design regulatory decision by the end of the year, and I think the regulators have just published on that. We were hoping for it maybe by Q1 this year. And even then, that high-level design has to be converted into a fairly detailed design, which will hinge around daily auctions or something like that. But again, all of this has to be wrapped in how do you manage usability. If you don't have that as part of the answer, it won't be able to deliver. And we would definitely need to break down the barriers for new technologies to allow us to solve these problems. And that on we'll talk about how we're doing technology enablement in the operations section. So if we go to the next slide. And around all of this, you got to say, look, we're building a range of very complicated IT systems, and they all have to talk to each other, and that's not easy. And you just can't suddenly design it. We're reckoning from high-level design to actually making a difference to change investments. You probably need about 4 years. There's no point in just saying, until the market people, the investors can see how the market works, it's unlikely that they'll suddenly make a big, strong investment. So if you accept that from a high level design to actual implementation, having systems up and running, that people are confident to make is 4 years or maybe 5 years, you really need to have these decisions in the next year so that they're ready in around 24, 25 to drive investment. I would already note that the RES 1 and 2 will deliver 3,000 megawatts of solar and wind by 23, 24. So straight away, we're in a situation where there's a misalignment, and that's going to be operationally difficult to manage. So that's really the whole thing. If we go to the last slide, the draft roadmap is basically, that's what we think it's going to look like. We think it's pragmatic if you get into these things with timely decisions. A lot of these things, I think the initial future arrangements will be taking the existing services, certainly reserves and ramping and converting them over, and maybe doing fixed term contracts on electromagnetism. I think congestion and some of the more certainly needs to further work with the industry, especially the DSOs, because congestion, I think, is on the transmission network, but I think also has to work with any congestion that's on the distribution network. I think Brexit, we need to solve, align energy markets and operations quickly. That's certainly something that has to be done, and I think the Article 12 and 13 implementation is largely, we need an answer on that, and I think that's going to be another consultation coming out soon, but then we need to implement it and move on. And I do think by about 23, 24, we really need to have a discussion. What is the energy market design for recoupling, and what do we need in the capacity market given our changes? And that's really put it all together. Killian, I think it's then, thank you, questions.
Thanks, John. Really good, comprehensive presentation. Thanks, John. I'm going to give you a break for 1 minute to catch your breath and actually drink a small sip of water. And I'm just going to jump into the first question that's came in, and it's having a lot of popularity around it. And Robbie, if you wouldn't mind taking this one. It's important to emphasize that the targets in the program for government are 8.2 gigawatts of onshore and 5 gigawatts of offshore by 2030, not just the 70% RES. Further, these are not the game changer, but a step forward to carbon neutrality by 2050. And that comes in from Andrew Burke. Robbie?
Yeah, great. Thanks very much, Andrew, for the question. I'll take the second part first. Look, absolutely agree. We're on a journey towards 2050. And indeed, carbon neutrality by 2050, and probably could well be well in advance of 2050 as well. It has to be said, and that's something that needs to be looked at. But obviously, as part of the work we're doing here, we were looking at that future-proofness beyond 2030. We're very clear that this is a step on the journey out over the next decade. I think, maybe looking back 10 years ago, I think our RESE would have been around 10 or 15%. Now, just last week in Ireland, we're at about 43%. By 2030, 70% is the target. And indeed, look, further on, it's to go to carbon neutrality. So look, we're on a step in the journey. We've a lot of really good work that has been done. We've a lot of work that we need to do out to 2030, and shaping our electricity future talks about that from a networks, markets and operations perspective. But absolutely, totally agree. There further work is required to go out beyond 2030 as well, as we look to, I guess, push it further as well. So it's a step in the journey, really. I think the point, look, around the different sectoral targets. Look, shaping our electricity future was is looking at operating a power system from an electricity market and networks perspective with 70% renewables by 2030. Look, we are very conscious that there's in the programme from government, there's different sectoral targets as well. And look, they're split out in different ways. But look, we're very, I know I'm kind of jumping ahead in somewhat to the network section of this, but which we're talking about later on today. But if you take the different approaches, one of the approaches, if you could simplify it, is kind of offshore heavy, and then approach 2, 3, and 4 are onshore heavy approaches. And really, look, we are very clear, or we've been very careful to make it clear that, look, we believe that the final answer is likely to be a blend of the different approaches. And you know, what we're looking to get as part of this feedback in the consultation is from the industry, from all the different Rural Link, the EU Council of Ireland, our deliberative assembly, what's their views on how that evolves. But look, absolutely, we believe that the final answer is going to be a blend of the different approaches. So it's and in some ways, to be honest with you, in the networks element, we wanted to be demonstrably different with the different approaches to have a conversation and start a conversation like this.
Thanks a million, Robbie. I'll cut you there because I'm conscious that I don't want to steal too much of your thunder for the later session on network, but it's a really good question, and we may come back to it later on as well. Just one for yourself, John. It appears from your presentation that the zero main gen is being assumed to achieve for zero technical curtailment in 2030. However, it does not appear from the consultation paper that zero main gen is being proposed. Can you clarify?
So I think Owen will talk a large part about the engineering aspects, but in general, I think when you look at it, yeah, we're going to have to get it probably, and we put this in our public response on the future arrangement. We're looking at maybe going down to about 15,000 megawatt seconds of electromagnetism on the island system as possibly possible by 2030. And if you just get that from conventional plant, even if they've lowered their min gen, and that probably is 8 sets, you know, still a 6, 7 sets, you won't have enough space for the renewables. So I think for 2030, we need to have a lower min gen than for 2020. It's 70% renewables. And how we achieve that, we need to look at market ways to do it. So I definitely think, what I would know for DS3, we have effectively dropped 2 sets because the amount of reduction in the min load of the units since DS3 came in is in the order of, I think, 500 megawatts to 600 megawatts, which effectively means that was 2 or 2.5 sets of megawatts that have come off, but we haven't taken any sets off. That's something that's coming in the next 6 to 12 months potentially. But yeah, it's definitely there for 2030, and we use SNSP. You're not going to be able to get to 95% SNSP if you haven't effectively got rid of some conventional plant or got their min gens much lower. It's a curve fit, the SNSP, but it's not a bad curve fit because it implicitly deals with the min gen, but own in progressing the operational aspects of the SEOF has to explicitly deal operationally with the min gen, and I'm sure he'll take you through that in that discussion.
And we'll probably pick that up later on as well in the future operations element. It's just after the break. Just in relation, and thanks for the question as well. Yeah, just in relation to from Intercon, I'm concerned that while the grid costs are concerned over the future scenarios, the overall cost to the consumer is not.
Liam, on that one, it's something that I think we have done some internal analysis on that. We have to get it validated. We've looked at a range of costs estimated. That's why But as I say, I definitely think you can make that investment and do it all if you align the market so there's efficiencies. I think if demand side gets a little bit of that service revenue because it's providing active services, whether it's 5-day ramping capacity or system services. It looks like, in our view anyway, with reasonable assumptions on bid prices and res auctions for supports, that the net cost, I go back to that €2,000 bill that I said at the start. If it's €2,000, and then I also say to you, put in a solar panel, it's 1,800, and if you put in some smart control that we can get system services appropriately, and that includes engaging with DSOs and making sure it works for the distribution network and all that. It looks like it looks in our things that it's affordable. It actually is a cheaper cost, depending on how much you assume the demand side comes in on residential. But it is all important that we align the markets to solve the problems in the future, not the way they were necessarily built today. So if we just leave the markets that we have the way they are, we are not going to get there. But if we do, or at least debate the issues that we're bringing forward and come up with answers as an industry that, and they may not be exactly the EirGrid only answers, that's fine. But as long as they're well considered, I think our analysis is showing that it will be more affordable to society in the transition. Because I use that argument. If it's €4,000 to everyone instead of 2,000, society won't like it, and it won't be accepted. So at high level, the affordability seems to be there. We haven't done all the sums.
Okay, just John, another question just coming in. It was a pre-submitted question from Grid Beyond. How do EirGrid see interactions with ESB networks changing, especially in the context of flexible markets?
I absolutely, and there's been a lot of engagement, and I think Owen will touch on it more because there's a very strong engagement in the operational zone. So I think it has to work for the distribution network. It has to work for the transmission network, but most importantly, it has to work for the consumer. We absolutely see it's hand in hand in this journey, and I think there's going to be challenges because ultimately the distribution network, if we're using a lot of the demand side response to solve our challenges, it also has to be able to solve the challenges on the distribution network and has to work for the consumer. So absolutely, and it's not just ESB networks, it's also NIEM, because again, both of those distribution systems impact the system of Ireland and Northern Ireland. You know, and so yes, it has to fundamentally be way more. It needs to work way better than it's ever worked before.
Yeah. No,
and in fairness, all the parties are working in that. So it's not like I wouldn't want anyone coming away, I think, to think that we're saying that it's not. I think there's really strong efforts to solve the problems, but they are difficult problems. And there's been great engagement with NIEN, Sony, EirGrid, and ESB and for the last year and a half in this regard, in fairness. And Owen, I think, I won't steal Owen's thunder because a lot of it's with Owen. I'm involved in it, but I'd say 80% of the work is with Owen's team.
Just loads of questions coming in at the moment, so just you've hit the nail on the head, John, with some of the questions. So the next question up for you, John, is just in relation to from Alan McHugh. Once relevant consultation has been completed and decisions made, what methods do you envisage will be implemented to ensure continued certainty for investors to support their investment life cycle?
Well, the first thing I would say is I don't see it about certainty on return. I see it as certainty of process. And I think we need to get away from, there are risks, Alan. There have to be risks, and the investor has to acknowledge you're making an investment and there are risks. So we are looking for capacity, system services and energy, a degree of certainty. We are going, this is the market design. It will be there for 10 years at least. So you're not that worried that things are going to change. It addresses usability, so you see where the risks that you can't control are moved from yourself to the consumer. And we have proposed ways in system services and the energy market and how to align that and give the commitments. And we're happy to engage in that. And so really what I would say is the process of certainty should outline, here are the risks. Some of the risks are outside your control. The ones inside your control, you'll get good money for. But if you don't deliver those, you're not going to get the money you thought. And as an investor, that should worry you. So you should be able to back end off those risks with your OEM contract. But you do that at the start when you make the investment. and it's not about availability and efficiency. That's the OEM contract from the last decade. That's not going to work. So we need to set up market structures with the proper market discipline to address the technical scarcities we see, acknowledge that adequacy is changing. It's not the same as it was 20 years ago, which is largely the design that we largely copied the CRM mechanism in the United Kingdom, which is not having the challenges we have. And I don't think it's worked the way, and we need to think about it a little bit. So certainty of process, we would certainly be saying there's value in this, and certainly in system services and capacity. And as long as you stay within that value, you shouldn't be touching any of the rules. And so that gives you a certainty of process and a certain look. And we've done some analysis in Syslex, and we're getting that validated. Syslex is a European project where we looked at challenges out to 2030. Our value for system services in that was about 740 million per year by 2030. Right, so you can pay up to that if you solve the issues and they're able to operate at 100% SSP. That's something we want to bring to the regulators, and we're getting that validated as well. So certainty of process is there for the next 10 years. There's a value that as long as we stay within it, that's it. You'll know what the auction rules are, or there's fixed term contracts, that's fine. And we've solved the principle of usability. But the rest of the risks, if I don't operate, if I don't provide the services I said, if I don't give the information that I'm going to be there in time when I say I'll be there, I'm going to build in 3 years' time. I think those are the risks that are within your control. And those are the risks that I do not think you should get certainty on, but I do think you should get a credible return for reasonable risks taken that are clear. And that's what we're trying to design into all our markets.
Just to give you a break for a minute, John, I'm going to ask Owen. It's a question coming in from Peter Lynn. Great progress being made on increasing the SNSP limit. However, the vast majority of renewable generation curtailment is driven by min-gen and not SNSP limits. As a result, the focus now needs to shift to reducing the min-gen. Otherwise, there'll be no benefit of further increased SNSP. Now, I know, Owen, you might be covering some of this later on, but you might want to give a short answer.
Yeah, that's a great question, and a good point. I suppose what we've been focused on for the last while is bringing that SNSP level up to 75%. I'm pleased to say, I suppose, that today we are starting a trial of operation at 75%, which is a huge milestone for the industry. And as you know, it's thanks to the collective efforts of everybody involved that we've got to this point. But we do now need to look out and see what are the next steps. And one of those will be to try and reduce that minimum generation level and reduce the number of, the minimum number of sets, requirements, etc., that we have on the system, because they will become increasingly binding, as Peter suggested.
Okay.
That is the plan, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Owen. Thanks very much. Just back to yourself, John. So I'll probably get in about one or two more questions. Very important that the capacity markets, again, it's very similar to the last question about not incentivizing inflexible generation onto system, because that's going to affect dispatch, and are the mechanisms that can be targeted for alternative technologies like DSM and storage being part of the mix. And then the final part of the question is, in addition, is there any new thermal generation being progressed? If there is any new thermal generation being progressed into through the capacity market, that it should be future-proofed so that it could operate on a zero carbon system like hydrogen. What's your thoughts, John?
Yeah, well, I think there's three things that I think I'll come in. The first thing is markets on themselves are the incentives. What's invariably around, and this is a more general, what's also there is standards or rules of law. And so it's not just about the incentives. Our standards are the Greek code, and that needs to be credibly enforced. And Owen's going to talk, we need to update the standards to say, look, if you're going to build something, you need to have a reasonable capability going forward. Now, that standard will always be engaged with industry to say, but that's unreasonable to ask all of those things. But then once we get that standard, doesn't mean you won't get paid for those services. That sense. So I think for conventional plant, I think there's a real potential to say, look, if we're going to build more conventional plant, maybe they need to have a more min load than they currently. I think it's 50% or 40%. I can't remember off the top of the head. That's why we were incentivizing below that with the SIR product. But there is a real question, particularly for open cycle gas turbines and stuff like that. Maybe the standard for their min load should be a lot lower than it is today. Now that has issues of, well, does that mean you have to buy a more expensive plant because the burners and all that? And that's a discussion that will have to happen at the grid codes in Ireland and Northern Ireland. But in any case, if somebody's building a generator right now, the chances are they're going to be held to account to the grid code that is currently in play. It's no longer retrospective. That's something that's come out of Europe. I probably agree with that because retrospection doesn't help investment because it's a risk if things are going to change. And I think we certainly would say retrospection is bad and you shouldn't do it. So please understand, we have to get the right standards, get them quick so the industry knows it, engages it, and the standards then become what the standards. On top of that, then we need to look at what incentives we need above that more generally, and that's redesign the thing. And then the last thing is to say, look, a lot of this is if we're getting it from new technologies and stuff, and we need to be open-minded. So to the extent the incentive is in some way skewed or it doesn't allow for new technology, we need to eke that out. But we also need to break down the barriers for working collectively and effectively with new technologies. And I do think there's a lot of work in there in the demand side space. That work will have to involve certainly the DSOs in a very big way. I think new technologies like storage definitely help, but I would say we are seeing overheating in the current arrangements. We could talk about that if that's requirement, and I think maybe we have more storage than we actually need for 2020 looking to come in, and I think so, and I'm not surprised because we were looking for 2020, not for post these. We need a new set of arrangements to drive for 2030. So it's about, yes, new technologies, but you have to set the standards first. You have to then clear on what you're going to incentivize on top of that, and you have to break down the barriers for new technologies so that we can comfortably use them the way the others. And that goes through capacity markets. I think there's definitely work in the capacity markets about taking away undue barriers for some of the new technologies other than conventional plant. And forward modeling is part of that access. Incentivizing future performance rather than backcasting is a part of that. But the technologies also have to deliver. And it's how do you make that happen? So to the extent somebody says, in 4 years' time, I'll deliver great performance, and they are either very late or they don't deliver great performance, there has to be a meaningful threat of enforcement or a meaningful penalty. And I don't think they're there at the moment in the way that's needed for it to work effectively.
Thanks, John. And do you think anything should be done specifically for hydrogen under the market, or would you see that just as being similar to all other technologies?
I personally don't think the TSO or the electricity system should be mandating technologies. I do think, though, from a market perspective, while we are bound, so if we go back to that argument, energy markets are based actually in a principle that a good proxy for the utility of consumers is energy. So the more energy you consume, the more utility you get. It never was, it never is. It was a decision made in 1896 that has just actually propagated all the way through. But if we can move to our wholesale structures, where there's more money in system service and capacity as the energy market becomes and supports, right, and the energy market starts to become more volatile and trend down, I would like to see the possibility that instead of a usage model, a unit charge of electricity and a standing charge, you get a subscription model for, I will manage all your energy needs, €2,000 if you do nothing. If you put in a solar panel, 1,800. If you put in smart control, 1,600. In that way, you're actually now selling utility. And if you get somebody else and you start thinking of selling utility to the consumer, you might say, I'll also manage all your transport needs, because I'll use hydrogen in your car if you need it, or I'll manage that for you. It's a subscription model, and I'll just give me €3,000 a year for that. And I think if we can move to the utility model at the consumer level, we have a real chance of intersectoral coupling that you won't get by saying, I'm selling hydrogen, I'm selling electricity, I'm selling gas. That won't happen. You sell a utility. You can't sell that utility at the moment because we are fundamentally on a usage model in the energy market based on principles. And I use Steve Jobs on that. That Steve Jobs had the iPhone designed way before he got it onto market. And the main reason that stopped him, he couldn't get the telecoms companies to give him a subscription model on the data he was using. It was all a usage model. If you're my age, there were two things your mammy said to you when you were growing up: turn off the immersion, and God, is that a phone call to America? Get off the phone. And I'm saying we've got to move it. We won't move it by 2030, but I think we're putting in the wholesale structures that allow that to come maybe shortly after 2030.
Thanks, John. And you'll be happy to hear this may be your final question, depending on how the answer actually goes. Just in relation, and it's coming in from Stephen Douglas. And it's, is the current zonal configuration appropriate? Noting, as you mentioned, that LCCS are becoming increasingly binding in some of the constituent markets. Also, any views on the zonal versus nodal pricing in SEM?
Look, I think I'll leave the SEM. We for those who don't know, in Ireland we seriously looked at locational marginal pricing back in. It was called MAE back in 2002 for 2 years, and we looked at it in nodal price, and it's an argument that's coming up in Europe. And my general view is I think people are they're mistaken about energy markets, and I think it's broader than that. But I think they're also mistaken that a nodal market will in some way solve your problems. It doesn't solve any of this renewable problems that Owen will talk about, electromagnetism. It doesn't even recognize it, and you'll still have that price, fairly low price with lots of renewables and collapses. But also there's a general belief that if in some way you get price rents because of congestion, that will solve the congestion. Now, there are real barriers to building network that Robbie Ahern is about to talk about. And there's no amount of price differential that's going to solve Robbie's problems and society's problems. So I think it's a flawed economic model. It's a lovely theory that standard market design in the States will solve your congestion. It will just tell you that it's more expensive there. And some people will get supernormal profits, but they're not necessarily in themselves solving the challenge. Now, congestion, though, I think it's a type of system service. I think it's something that could be done to help get behaviors in certain parts of the network to ease the need for network. And I don't think you need either nodal and or zonal. It makes a difference. I think if you're designing it for congestion, you can design it into either market, but a different way. And I would look at what National Grid have done on some of their projects and how they've been incentivized new types of thinking about certain corridors that they're building in between Scotland and England. And I think there's something in that. I think I do it a slightly different way, but I think there's definitely in that. So congestion can be solved. I think the focus on nodal and zonal is a little bit fraught. However, I would say Europe is spending an inordinate amount of time of reviewing this at the moment. So Acer has currently asked NSOE to review and do modelling on nodal for Europe. I don't think they will switch it. I just don't think Europe are going to move away from what they have, which ultimately means we're not going to move away from what we have. So I come back to the LCCs that are in the capacity market and the concept of where SEM is a single node. I think they're reasonable assumptions. I don't think they are bad assumptions. I think the issue is capacity. You really need to look at that in a much more fundamental way, with small changes being the outcome, not big changes, rather than worry about whether it's nodal or the zone is right. I think the zone is good enough and move forward on that basis.
And I think we're just coming up close now to 10:30. I think we've 2 minutes to go, so I'm probably going to call it a close here at the moment. Give you John a break. You won't be disappearing from us. You'll be on the panels, so we will have the opportunity to come back in and answer some of the questions as well. And as I said earlier, some of the questions are coming in, we know are probably more appropriate in the future networks or the future operations. So we will come to those in due course. So I just wanted to say at this stage, we're probably going to take a coffee break and we'll come back and Owen will take us through. So if everybody can be back, we'll kick off we'll recommence again at 10:45 sharp. So if you could come back at that point in time, it would be much appreciated. Thank you very much, folks. Welcome back, folks. We just want to kick off again, and I'm just going to introduce Owen Kennedy, and Owen will take us through the future operations part of the presentation and the work today. And over to yourself, Owen.
Thanks, Liam. I hope everybody can hear me okay. As Liam said, my name's Owen Kennedy, Head of Future Operations with EirGrid. I've been working with the company for the last 13 years or so. Prior to that, I spent some time in academia, and with my time during my time with EirGrid, I've worked across a range of areas, a lot of project work and things like Gate 3, Celtic Interconnector, system services, the new system services arrangements brought in as part of DS3, the strategy program. And I've taken up this new role of head of future operations about 6 or 7 months ago. And it's a really exciting space to be involved in. And I'm hoping I can set out some of that today during this presentation. In terms of my presentation, I'll talk at a high level about some of the operational challenges of operating a power system at the very high levels of SNSP that we'll be looking to operate at in 2030. Talk about the operational transition journey out to 2030. Try and set out as well at a high level the operations roadmap to 2030 that we will enable us to safely and securely increase the amount of variable non-synchronous renewable generation on the system. And then I'll talk a bit about the draft program of work as well that we've set out in the consultation to get your feedback on. I suppose while we're looking out to 2030 today, I think it is helpful as well to look back as well at the last program of work, because here we are in 2021, we're looking out to 2030. We were in a similar position in 2011, looking out at the 2020 targets. And, over that last 10 years, there's been a, huge amount of change on the electricity system. There's been the wide scale integration of renewable generation. There's been the emergence and rapid growth of the demand response sector. There's been increasingly sophisticated electricity markets and commercial arrangements put in place during that time as well. And the DS3 program, which was established back in 2011, has been a huge enabler of that transition. And it's been a hugely successful program of work. And that's down to really the collective efforts of people right across the electricity industry. And, just to call out some of the achievements, we've had, a lot of grid code changes made in that time. We introduced the new system services arrangements, as I mentioned earlier, increasing the number of services and enhancing the incentivization for those new services. We've introduced a whole range of systems and tools to help our grid controllers manage that increased complexity. The likes of the wind dispatch tool, the wind security assessment tool, EMS changes, and more recently, look ahead security assessment tool and interim ramping margin tools. We've had the rock off program of work, which is a real cross-industry effort as well. And ultimately, all of that has been, in pursuit of increasing and adapting our operational policy, in terms of how we manage and operate the system securely as we increase the amount of non-synchronous renewable generation. And over that period, we've increased it from 50%. And as I mentioned earlier, in response to one of the questions, we have today initiated a trial of 75% SNSP operation, and that follows on from a very, very successful 70% SNSP trial over the last number of months. So, that they're huge milestones for the industry, and we're really proud, I suppose, of that. I think looking out to 2030, we have, an increasing, a huge challenge ahead of us as well. It's, we're looking towards an increasingly decentralized power system, greater diversity of market participants. A lot of the change will clearly be driven by the decarbonisation objectives, but there will be, changes just driven by digitalization, new technology as well, and they can be drivers of change to the energy ecosystem in their own right. I think what we're going to need to do is to put in place all of the right standards, the processes, the tools, the services to be able to operate the system at these increased levels of complexity. And the transition to that new program of work I'll talk about later on in this presentation. But it is a really challenging future, I think it's fair to say, and we don't have all of the answers right now. Part of this program is to work through and to figure it all out. We will be working closely with others as part of that, with partners, For example, like we're working as part of a global power system transformation with other TSOs who are also striving to reach these very high levels of renewable generation. And clearly, as part of this consultation as well, we're asking your views on what we set out in the consultation document. If we could go to the next slide, please, Killian. Thanks. So on this slide, I suppose we're setting out some of the challenges. It gives you a sense of the scale of the challenge, really. And we have a number of graphs you can see there. One for inertia, rock-off, SNSP, and min units. And they are like effectively distribution curves. So they're based on the output of modeling used, done as part of the Tomorrow's Energy Scenarios work. So modeling all 8,760 hours of the year and looking at, how was the system operated in those particular hours. And if we start with the third graph down there, say SNSP, we can see, and I suppose the way these graphs work is where you have a kind of a hump in the curve. You're looking at operating in a lot, that's the times when you're operating most hours of the year. So we're operating, this study would have shown that we were operating very high levels of SNSP above our current operating limits, or as they were, for quite a large part of the year. And I think if we look at the minimum units piece, and that's in response to a question from earlier as well, there was a discussion around min gen levels and minimum number of units. What this graph is showing, I suppose, is the assumptions that were used in the modeling. So we had assumed in the modeling that we could reduce the number of minimum units from 8 down to 4 for the purposes of the modeling, and that showed that at those levels you could meet the 70% targets. Now, I suppose what we're not saying necessarily is that it's 4 units is the target. We're trying to reduce minimum, conventional generation levels more generally across the system to as low a level as we can. But in this modeling, we had used an assumption of 4. I'm taking the top 2 graphs there as well in terms of inertia. We currently and rock-off. From the inertia perspective, we currently have a floor limit of 23,000 megawatt seconds, and we are undertaking a rock-off trial at the moment of 1 hertz per second, and you can see that as you kind of reduce the amount of inertia on the system, and we'd be operating down below that floor for quite a large part of the year, you can have higher rates of change of frequency on the network. So these unprecedented operation levels, if we don't do something about it, we can cause significant operational challenges. And I've set out some of those operational challenges on the next slide. If we could move to that one, Killian. So there's if no action is taken, there are significant technical challenges and operational challenges. And I don't propose to talk through all of these today, but I suppose there are various categories of operational challenge. We have kind of stability issues, frequency stability as a result of if you don't have enough inertia or enough reserves on the system. Voltage stability, similarly, as you take synchronous units off the system, your dynamic voltage control, fault current availability levels, and so on, can result in issues. Similarly, with transient stability, reductions in synchronizing and damping torque can be challenging. Other kind of areas would be in and around weather dependent generation. So forecasting becomes very, very important, and having the best forecasts possible is extremely important to be able to manage the ramping issues. So with a large amount of wind and solar generation, you can have quite distinct ramps on the network that you have to be able to manage. Congestion is another one I think that's worth calling out, and this links in, I suppose, to the presentation Robbie will be given later on the transmission networks side of things. But all the way through to 2030, and indeed in 2030, we want to be able to use the network in the most optimal fashion and try and minimize transmission constraint during that period. I might move on to the next slide, please. Yeah, so one of the things, that's clear is that we're not going to solve all of these issues overnight, and we are currently doing some work looking at potential mitigations for a number of these issues that we've seen in our studies, whether they Sysflex studies done, internal studies, and so on. And we will be publishing a paper on that later in the quarter, just on some of those potential mitigations. It won't cover all of the issues, but it'll cover quite a few of them. I think, and as we look out to 2030, the portfolio of service providers is already changing. We are getting services from a whole range of service providers that we weren't getting services from a number of years back. I think we'll increasingly get more services from these new types of technologies as the decade progresses. In terms of like the journey itself to 2030 in SNSP, I think there's a number of stages really. In the early part of the decade, it's about identifying the kind of changes that we need to make to the systems, to our processes. It's about identifying the services that are required on the system to enable us to make the operational changes. And as we progress, then it's around incentivizing those services and getting that needed capability onto the system. And all the way through this, we want to be developing our know-how. So how can we use this capability so that when it does arrive, in the mid to later half of the decade, we have the capability to fully utilize it and to be able to operate the power system at these in these more complex configurations. In terms of SNSP level itself, as I mentioned earlier, we've moved over the last number of months from 65 to 75 or to 70%. And today we're commencing a 75% SNSP trial. We're looking to push that to 85% SNSP by the middle of the decade, and then push that on up towards 95% later in the decade, while also tackling many of the other operational constraints as well. Next slide, please. One of the things that's clear is as we look at the future, it's a much more decentralized future. A lot of the generation, the system services provision will be connected on the distribution system. So it's an increasingly decentralized portfolio, and that partnership between the TSO and DSO will become increasingly important. And we are working very closely with the DSO, with ESB networks in Ireland and with NIE networks in Northern Ireland. And it's really important that the operation of both the transmission and distribution networks are optimized to deliver value to consumers and to really enhance the overall power system operational performance. So it's a key partnership, and it's across a whole range of areas. And I'll talk a little bit about those later on in the presentation. Next slide, please. Okay, in terms of the operations roadmap on what we need to do, there's 6 points. There's 3 set out on this slide and 3 on the next slide. But everything that we do is kind of underpinned by studies and analysis. So there's studies that we look at in terms of the longer term horizon, looking out to 2030, the types of challenges we expect to face, looking at potential solutions. And then as we become closer to make operational changes, we really have to do much greater further assessments as the power system evolves in that period. So this is an ongoing process of studies and analysis all the way through the decade. We have to, as well, ensure that we set and clarify operational standards. So that includes grid codes, it includes system services protocols, and that we have, as John O'Sullivan mentioned earlier, got the right performance monitoring in place so that we are monitoring against the standards that we set. We do need to enhance the system services arrangements further to introduce new services as appropriate, and to be able to facilitate service provision by new and innovative technologies as well. Next slide, please. So other things we need to do then are to remove barriers to entry and enable the integration of new technologies at scale. I suppose, in a traditional power system, a lot of the systems and processes, etc., over the years would have been developed with conventional type technology in mind. And what we want to be able to do is to identify where those barriers exist and to try and remove them, and to enable that integration of new technology. We also need to develop new and enhanced control center tools and systems. This is, I suppose, a really important piece of this, in that, if we get all of this capability onto the power system, we need to be able to ensure we can use it, and dispatch it and schedule it, and I suppose that capability can be used in the most optimal manner. And that's, I suppose, to help us manage that increased complexity in the power system of the future. And I suppose what all of that can lead to is then is continued evolution of operational policy. So, for example, and it's been, going back to some of the questions from earlier, tackling the minimum number of generation units on the system, looking at overall min-gen levels, and so on. That's ultimately what we have to try and do, is to be able to evolve how we operate the power system. Next slide, please. So John has already spoken about the future arrangements, but just for system services, but just to set out kind of our plans here. We have done an initial identification of technical scarcities, which we've set out in the consultation paper. We are doing, as I said, a piece looking at some potential solutions. We're not saying it's the optimal answer at this point, but we're saying we're looking at potential solutions to those technical scarcities and seeing, that they can be solved. And then over the next year or two, we'll be, I suppose, doing further analysis to set up and establish the system services products and doing the detailed design of those, so that they're ready for the future arrangements go live on the 1st of May 2024. And I suppose on an ongoing basis after that, kind of reviewing the efficacy of the arrangements, make sure that we are getting the capability that we need to operate the power system at these higher levels of variable non-synchronous renewable generation. Next slide, please, Kalina. Yeah, so, what we've done in the consultation paper is set out a program of work at a fairly high level around what we intend to do. I'm looking for your views on it, but it's effectively set around 4 pillars: standards and services, operational policies and tools, technology enablement, and TSO, DSO. And if we go to the next slide, we've set out some of the work streams or focus areas that we see as being really important under each of these pillars. And if I start with the TSO, DSO element of it, and I've spoken already really about the importance of that partnership. And one of the key pieces here is to establish the TSO, DSO operating model of the future, to define the roles and responsibilities and ways of interaction and ways of working between us. We also need to develop the TSO, DSO interfaces to enable the sharing of data and information that can lead to, I suppose, enhanced coordination in decision making across both system operators. Flexible network coordination is really important. As John mentioned earlier, congestion management will become increasingly important on both networks, and we need to make sure we manage the change so that the needs of both systems are met throughout that process. In terms of standards and services, then really this is about putting in place the standards, the grid code standards, and establishing the system services commercial frameworks to deliver the system services we need on the power system. We need as well to be able to operate the grid as flexibly as possible, and that's where we see a lot of the work happening here. The operational policies and tools section or pillar is focused, I suppose, on the long-term horizon studies and the short-term horizon studies and operational policy evolution as we go. Control center tools, as I mentioned already, is an increasingly important piece here, and flexible network management, managing that, the network as we transition out to 2030. Training is a big piece of that as well, ensuring that we have our control center engineers and everybody is able to, and ready to use the operational tools that we deliver in this time. Technology enablement, then, the last pillar, is a key focus area as well, to remove any barriers to entry or barriers to participation for new technologies. As I said earlier, systems and processes over the years, grid codes, the whole way, were set up with conventional generation in mind. And what we're trying to do, I suppose, is identify the barriers across a range of areas. We're looking at demand side management, hybrids, renewables, small scale generation, storage, large energy users, but also other technologies, and working to ensure that we identify and I suppose remove any barriers, be they technical or commercial or contractual, etc. Next slide, please. So in terms of a draft roadmap, you know, this is quite high level, as you can see, but as I said earlier, we're looking at moving towards 85% SNSP by the middle of the decade and 95% towards the end of the decade. A key part of achieving that will be putting in place the grid code changes that we will need to identify over the next year or two. In advance of putting in place the new system services arrangements. And in parallel with those new system services arrangements and recognizing that there may be new services or evolved services, new performance monitoring arrangements that can ensure that we are monitoring the services in the right way and getting the performance we need will be part of that thinking as well. One of the processes we have in play at the moment is a qualification trial process, and we'd be looking to work with the DSO on an ongoing basis to ensure that is delivering what we needed to, and working with the DSO on various things such as residential demand side services, and that's a piece of work that they are leading on at the moment. Control Center of the Future roadmap is something that it's a project we started about a couple of months back now, and it's starting to come to fruition. And really what it's looking at is looking out to 2030, looking at all of those technical challenges that I've spoken about and trying to identify the technologies and tools and systems changes that will be required to enable us to operate that power system of the future and to set out a roadmap for how we get from where we are now to that new control center of the future. That will involve over time then delivering on those new and enhanced control center tools and systems. So look, I suppose if I was to summarize, there's big challenges ahead, but we have a plan in place. It's a really exciting area to be working in, and I think I think we can do this by working collectively. So happy to take any questions people have.
Yeah, Owen, there's a good few questions coming in.
Okay.
So thank you very much. As always, I'll give you a break initially so that you can have a drink of water or something as we move our way through it. So Robbie, just while we're waiting, maybe if you can clarify. Can you clarify the interaction with the Sony consultation, please? And this is coming in from Kate Dooley.
Hi, thanks, Liam. Thanks very much, Kate, for the question. The Sony concept, there's actually a workshop or a forum like this happening today I suppose, virtually from Belfast, where we're talking about shaping our electricity future and specifically the Northern Ireland elements of it. Look, naturally enough, we have an all-island electricity market. We operate the power system, in close tandem between the control centres in Dublin and Belfast. And then also we have the networks piece as well. So look, there's an equivalent process underway in Northern Ireland at the moment. But look, it has to be said they are very related. And indeed, this afternoon there's a virtual forum like this to talk about it from the zoning of the Northern Ireland elements in the same way we're talking about the Ireland elements here this morning.
Thanks, Robbie. Owen, just a question coming in from Andrew Burke. We will need to operate with zero carbon system services by 2030. How will this be achieved?
By zero, yeah. So I think what we're with zero carbon system services, I think what we're really talking about is how can we get to a point where we're getting the services that traditionally we would have gotten from conventional generation, from other service providers, and that is something we're looking at quite closely. We have, as John has spoken about earlier, as people have spoken, we've got quite a lot of our reserve services from new types of technologies such as batteries, from demand side management, from renewables. We need to look at the other services as well. So the inertia product that we've introduced has been very successful in reducing minimum generation levels. We need to though think about can we get, or should we be getting inertia from low megawatt output inertia devices, and some of these devices can also provide other services, whether that's reactive support, post fault, short circuit current, and help to solve some of the wider issues as well. So what we'll be doing as well is identifying these services, and then working to ensure that the commercial arrangements actually deliver those capabilities.
Thanks, Owen. And this is a question that's coming in, and it's for both Owen, yourself, and for John. Do you see flexible fuel switching technology such as gas to electricity for industrial heating fitting more into the DS3 system service space or balancing market? And how can EirGrid help to facilitate the industry to get this new technology into the market? So I'm going to say, John, do you want to go first? And then Owen, if you want to talk.
Yeah, Liam, there's a high level, it really goes back to the utility arguments or thing. If you're basically saying to somebody with flexible fuel that they set a home, let's say, who has oil heating and let's say an immersion heater or electricity, something like that, or storage heating, I'll just say that. Really, if you get the market structures right, and they're not there, and it will take a while for them, then it becomes quite easy to say, look, we'll manage your heating and your electricity needs. We'll switch it and we'll give it to you for 2,000, 1,800 euros when you'll be providing services. I'll give it to you for 1,600. So that when we start talking about utility to the consumer, it becomes a lot easier to see how that proposition would appeal to the consumer. Then the question is, well, how do you make money on that proposition? And that's where we come back to. We need to identify the needs of the system for electricity, but also the needs of the heating. And that's not our competence. That's a heating organization to work that one out. There's technical capability to, obviously, in homes to switch between, or in businesses, switch between their oil heating and their electricity heating if they need it. But it has to meet their utility. So you need a utility map of those things. But I think we shouldn't be incentivizing that specific behavior. We should be looking at what the electricity systems and be open to how we might facilitate it. So to our extent, how would you performance monitor somebody for either services and balancing? And you'd be only looking at the electricity element of that, not the oil element. So if this flexible switching is, you're only looking at the electricity. But to answer the specific question, I would think, given the nature of our understanding heating requirements, which are generally a little bit longer term, you don't switch over instantaneously potentially on heating, but you might be able to at the business scale. I know certain processes need to run up their boilers on oil before they can switch off and stuff like that. I would say it's more than likely that you do that in the balancing services, which aren't system services, their energy utilization is more likely where that model would work. But again, I come back to how do we participate in the balancing platforms, because we're not in them at the moment. And so if we don't solve that conundrum, particularly when we recouple, we're not in the balancing services in Europe. So hopefully, Owen, over to you.
Yeah, I'd agree with a lot of what you said there, John. I wouldn't preclude their ability to provide system services as well to help with the likes of congestion, depending on locational aspects, etc. So I think there's, I don't think we have a definitive answer here, John. I think it's fair to say, but I'd agree with what you said.
And just on a question coming in here from, bear with me. Just disappeared. Coming in from Lisa Foley, just in relation to FlexTech, can you elaborate on the plan for FlexTech and what is the next steps around it? Sorry, Owen, can you hear me?
Yeah. So I suppose I can hear you. Yeah. It dropped out for a little bit there, but I think I picked up the bulk of the question. So on FlexTech, I think knowledge, maybe stakeholder engagement hasn't been as comprehensive as we might have envisaged over the last number of months. What I would say is just reaffirm our commitment to that program. It is a really important piece. It's a very, as I've mentioned already, it's going to be a core pillar of the work out to 2030, and it is an area that I'm focusing on at the moment and looking to, I suppose, communicate where we're at with that over the next number of months, but it is a big focus area, and it will be going forward.
Thanks, Owen. And just the next question coming in from Rory Griffin. Will reserve products be reviewed to mitigate high frequency event, high exports, large demand sites, etc., bringing different risks to operations?
So, I think the process we've used to date has worked quite well, but looking out to the future, I think we'll be re-examining that again. Sorry, Liam,
I think you're coming in and out,
my
Owen.
connection is... Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, Liam, I might be able to answer that for Owen if it helps.
Yeah, go ahead, John.
Sorry, yeah, look, Rory, yes, the whole point of as the nature of the risks to the system change, and like, for example, we might have big exports going up, but over frequency becomes, we're a lighter system, we need a faster frequency. All of that is part of the SEOF operations practice to identify those technical scarcities. And certainly I see potentially, and I touched on frequency regulation, there may be a need. At the moment, we really only, in the grid code, the POR is defined as upward frequency management, and basically a loss of generation. I do think there is an asymmetric risk, but I do think over frequency is a risk for us as well as under frequency. So all of that's part of the physical review and then the valuation of that in the market space.
Thanks, John. Just while I have you, John, it's a question that came in earlier, and it was, can you elaborate more on what electromagnetism, including aside from synchronous inertia that you were mentioning earlier?
So a lot of people have got into the habit of calling things inertia or synthetic inertia, and really, when you think about an electromagnet, really what I'm saying is, it's the flux linkage actually in all the air gaps that we're linking that gives you fault current. It ties into it actually binds it mechanically, physically to the synchronous generator, and to the extent we need that flux linkage at general level, and we need the weight of the system, or we have to have a faster response. And so rather than link it just to inertia, we could get lots of big generators weakly coupled with electromagnetism, and it wouldn't work. They just pull out of the system. So I use and then also reactive power is in there as well. So reactive power or dynamic reactive power, it goes to grid forming as well, Liam, to the extent grid forming, people want to see that as part of the 2030. And I think myself and Owen would be of a view that it's not going to be a material part of our solution for 2030, 2040, a different question. I think we have to maintain enough electromagnetism, the equivalent of around 15,000 megawatt seconds, we think at the moment, but that's all has to be subject to proper analysis and all of that. But that's what we've said publicly. But that 15,000 megawatts, if you're getting it from 6 or 7 conventional plants that have min gens of 200 megawatts, you're in trouble. So we're looking at other ways of getting that electromagnetism and keeping the frequency on the system. Hopefully that explains that. Thanks,
John. Just coming in from Noel Caniff. So it's, first of all, it's to congratulate the team in relation to Owen and the team in relation to hitting the 75% SNSP trial. And I know, John, you've been very heavily involved in that over the last number of years. So it's to everybody on the call, and it's great to see that 10 years of work now coming to reach this point. So the real question is going with the climate bill and Ireland's 51% emissions reduction target to 2030. Removing as much CO2 from the power system as possible will be crucial. Min-gen has been referenced a lot this morning. 4 units, 700 megawatts of min-gen of gas is equivalent to over 1 million tons of CO2 as base load, as an example. Are EirGrid giving consideration on how to measure and minimize CO2 emissions as part of the wider shaping our electricity roadmap over the next decade? So I know there's a lot in that.
Yeah, and if I pick it up correctly, hopefully connection isn't particularly good at the moment. But look, in terms of our scheduling dispatch, we don't have a specific mandate to reduce, or to minimize CO2 emissions. It's implicitly captured in the wider process. What we are trying to do, though, is to maximize the amount of renewable generation we can get onto the system, which will, I suppose, contribute to that reduction in CO2 emissions. Part of that, and as Noel has mentioned there, is about just reducing down the amount of conventional generation we have on the system. That is a key focus area. I don't think we have all the answers to that yet. There's significant issues to deal with. We've obviously talked about reserves and electromagnetism, but ramping is a key consideration we have to manage there. But absolutely, the intent is to reduce down that minimum generation level, which will help to contribute to that CO2 emission reduction as well.
Thanks,
Just if I can come in, Liam, if I come in, just add to that, I think the focus on carbon neutral is probably, I would say it's looking at the wrong thing necessarily, and I would say if you get to a situation where we are getting our services from, let's say, non-synchronous technologies like wind and solar or storage and demand side, and we have a lot of our inertia and electromagnetic with synchronous condensers, and they are being supplied by non-synchronous sources of energy, de facto you have decarbonized your network. So because what we're trying to do is work, so we don't care where those the energy comes from to power the synchronous condensers or the back-to-back converters providing their services. And if we have 100% of the system coming from wind, it will be de facto renewable. And so I think what we are focusing on, which is the needs of the system, will actually deliver that the reduced carbon as a byproduct of trying to be able to operate the system up to the 100% renewables. Because if everything is from renewables and our services are being, that require energy to provide their services, are being powered by renewable energy, then we have decarbonized the system. So I would be caution. It's not in our legal mandate for decarbonisation. That would have to change. But I would also caution that, and I use Mark Twain as the best. It's not what we don't know that gets us into trouble. It's what we think that is that ain't that does. And if we focus on the wrong thing and put our focus on that, we may actually not get to where we're actually trying to achieve. And I would rather, I think the renewables target of that we put up and Owen's talked about and Robbie will be talking about and Liam's talking about, that's what we focus on, because as a result of that, I think we will come up with the engineering and market mechanisms to allow the decarbonisation rather than saying we're decarbonising and not looking at the issues on the power system to actually affect that.
Okay, thanks, John. Just is a question that's pre-submitted. Is the Sysflex Task 2.4 technical scarcity report sufficient to define optimum needs for 2030, since only one 70% scenario was in it?
Yeah, and I don't think we're saying that that's necessarily defining the optimum needs at this point. I think across all of the scenarios we've looked at, whether it's through Sysflex or through other studies we've undertaken, we've looked at snapshots from all of those at very high SNSP levels, having removed a lot of the operational constraints. And across all of those scenarios you see very similar issues. Now, there will be locational elements depending on where you've assumed things are connected and so on. And those issues, we have to manage. And those issues will evolve as well over the period to 2030 as the power system evolves, as the network evolves. So I think there's more work to be done. We're at the start of a process here in terms of the studies that we're undertaking, but they do give us a very good, strong sense of the technical challenges and the types of services we're going to need to be able to respond to those technical challenges.
Okay, thanks, Owen. Just one for yourself, Robbie. What is the current thinking on private wire arrangements in the future state? And that's coming in from Graham McWilliams.
Yep. So where we are with private wires at the moment, look, I understand that there's work due to happen in that space, but it's in that legislative space as well around private wires. But look, I know that the developers are looking to see what can be done around private wires as a way to, I suppose, kind of expedite connections to the grid and take advantage of existing infrastructure. So look, there's definitely a lot of merits in it. What I do think we need to do, however, is make sure that we balance the development of private networks against the kind of the development, or not restrict the development of future public networks, if that's the way we want to put it, because the electricity grid at the moment is there for the greater good. It's there for the good of all society, whether it's business, communities, you know, all the different parts of our country. And I think it's really important that we continue to preserve that, because at the end of the day, there's a social good to what we do.
Thanks, Robbie. And just a question coming in from Organisha Lumna, and it's probably towards John, yourself, and to Owen as well. Is 1 megawatt to 1 gigawatt to is megawatt? I'll get it right eventually, folks. Is megawatt to gigawatt scale flexible electrification of industrial heat part of the TSO vision to reduce dispatch down of RESI?
Not explicitly, but in general, yeah, empowering the demand side and is a key part of our both of the markets work and the technology enablement that Owen's talked about. The issue is, does that get you in and itself gigawatts of industrial participation? Not if it doesn't work for the business model of the industry, which goes back to we have to have a utility rather than an energy consumption offering to the consumer. If that doesn't happen, the consumer's looking just at energy costs or total, and he's looking at the loss of production in their system if they get it wrong. And until you bridge the utility of both the business and the electricity, and you can't do that, in my view, with an energy only sort of approach. You've got to move it into something. I go back to the 2,000 euros and the resilience of the power system. No one wants 4,000 or half the reliability. And I'm saying that's why the energy market doesn't actually on its own work, and it really is exacerbated in a financial stage at high renewables. And so yes, not specifically that we would drive and say we have to have this, but I do think we're driving out the barriers that allow it, that prevent it from participating, and we're creating the incentives at a high level that if you can do that, you will see reasonable revenues to make. And to the extent that works for your business model, allowing that you understand your business and heat and why you need it, that's got the greatest opportunity or the greatest potential for delivering the largest amount of capability from the demand side, which ultimately means it goes to the affordability of the whole transition, which is something we fully support.
John, just one coming in from Rory Costello. For us to develop projects that target the ancillary service market, it would be very helpful to have an outline of what that market will be paying for up to 2030. E.g., will the AS market pay for short circuit power specifically? Do EirGrid intend going down a procurement route similar to National Grid, the Pathfinder, for security of supply services?
Yeah, I think like we're key.
No,
Sorry,
go ahead,
John.
No, you go on.
Yeah, well, I think what I was going to say really was that it's, we want to be able to provide that clarity to industry as early as possible. There are regulatory, I suppose, there is regulatory work going on this year on that high level design for the new arrangements. In parallel to that, I suppose the future operations team will be looking at the services specifically, and I think, John, your team will be looking at the kind of procurement arrangements over time. One of the things we are looking at, though, and it's been set out very explicitly in the recent SEM committee paper, is that to look at fixed contracts, as they're called, for low megawatt output inertia, and that is something that we will be doing some work on over the next period, and I suppose informing industry on that approach, which is quite similar to that Pathfinder approach in GB. But Johnny, you might want to talk about that in terms of the longer term and the suitability of that.
So largely, the problem with fixed term contracts is that you're taking the problem on, you're separating the problem, and you're actually paying for individual products without actually letting choice to the consumer. They can't roll them all up, and that ultimately may be a more expensive solution in the long run. We certainly support the fixed term contracts right now for synchronous inertia products because we want it to be further along in the design at this stage. I certainly think there's a way of doing it into daily auctions, and that's all. But I would say the predominant mechanism that is being looked at, and we think it's right, is to move to a daily auction system for procuring the volumes, and those volumes will evolve over the decade. And as we get, so we don't want to prescribe that it'll be 15,000 megawatt seconds when actually, if we get there and we can operate down to 10,000 megawatt seconds in 2030. But what we need to do is not just daily auctions, allow for the investor to see where the risks will be managed that are within our control. And so that comes back to the usability thing. I would point out on the one significant difference I see in any electromagnetism or fixed term contract against the inertia pathfinder. An awful lot, about 80% of the money, the inertia pathfinder product that the National Grid ESO did, which came out with, I think they got 5 or 6 synchronous condensers procured of about 2,000 megawatt seconds. 80% of it was for the energy cost. And the capital cost is actually quite a small cost for the synchronous condensers. And we have already brought to the Trading and Settlement Code a modification which we think is right in principle and practical to implement. I think it's got the support, so we didn't. So I think some of the in discussions with the market participants, I think it might have been even ESB who have the exact design on it. But that's where the energy costs should be delivered, and that actually pays for the energy costs in the DBC costs in the energy market correctly. So hopefully our competition might actually procure just the capital costs of building a synchronous condenser or something like that. The energy costs will be correctly dealt with in the energy market. So actually, I would say if you look on a fixed term contract basis, it should be of a much lower value because we have got a more appropriate design for the enduring markets and thinking about high renewables.
Thanks, John, and thanks, Owen, for the presentation. I'm going to call it there in relation to questions. Just for those in relation to questions that we haven't answered, we looked through them during the break, and we take some of them offline, and we will be responding in due course. Those that are relevant for the subsequent next session, we keep those actually on the board. So look, it's new questions. Please keep them coming in, but there's lots of questions coming in. That doesn't mean that we're not answering. We may not get the chance to answer them here, but we will answer them offline afterwards. So thank you very much, folks, and we'll take another 15-minute break. Thanks a million, guys. Talk to you at 11:45. Good morning again, folks. We're just ready to kick off again. Just before I kick off, just to let everybody know that these slides will be available shortly after the event, so that it's the information that's in the consultation document in a more concise manner. So we want to make this as accessible to everybody as we possibly can. So that'll be made available shortly after the session today. So in the next day or so, we'll hopefully get these posted, and we'll send out a link to all the so everybody knows where they actually are on the website. We're now moving into the transmission network section, and Robbie Ahern will take us through this session. Over to you, Robbie.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much, Liam. I'm going to talk about the transmission network section of shaping our electricity future. So look, there's the three legs. We've operations, markets, and also the third leg that has an important role to play to get us out to 2030 is the evolution of the transmission network. Between the network that we have today in 2020, where we've about 4,500 megawatts of renewables on the power system, to the network we need to develop by 2030. Could I go to the next slide, please, Killian? So the work that we've done as part of shaping our electricity future, specifically on the networks element, is based on tomorrow's energy scenarios, the work that we would have done in 2019, where we would have gone out and engaged with members of the industry on their views of what the power system would look like to 2030 and indeed out to 2040. And it's really important that we do that because, look, it's important that we base this analysis on a starting point where we come up with an objective view of how things can evolve, and then look, we can iterate as required thereafter. So one of the key points to make is, look, our demand is expected to change very significantly in Ireland over the next decade. We're going to have the electrification of heat and transport, EVs and heat pumps, and that's going to affect all different parts of the country. But look, we also expect over the next decade a really significant growth in large energy user demand, for example, data centres in the Dublin area. In some scenarios, upwards of 30% of our electricity come 2030 could come from large energy users, and that demand growth is really it's exceptional, really, in the context of how other similar power systems are developing around the world. The next slide, please. Talks about our generation changes between now and 2030. Our generation portfolio is going to radically change over the next decade. This is, again, an excerpt from tomorrow's energy scenarios, but you can see there on the left in 2020, our generation portfolio, you've got coal and Money Point, coal up the north as well, the peat plants, etc. Over the next decade, that is going to change very significantly. We're going to see, for example, onshore wind across large parts of the country, the advent of solar and also offshore wind. And also we're going to see changes to our conventional generation portfolio as well, as plant retires and as new plant comes to connect onto the power system to make sure that we can continue to operate power, to provide power to our consumers 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. So our generation portfolio and our demand, underpinning demand portfolio, so to speak, is expected to change very significantly over the next decade. Next slide. And as a consequence of that, it's important that we change our electricity grid to reflect that. So to get to at least 70% clean electricity by 2030, we are going to need to make our grid stronger and more flexible. We're going to need to increase the capacity that the grid can carry, and we're going to need to carry out significant work to get it ready for 2030 to handle that transition. The next slide, please, Killian. So Ireland's electricity grid, more power is going to be carried out around our grid than ever before. So at the moment, we have about, I think it's 4,300 megawatts of wind installed in Ireland. And to a fair extent, that's been along the west coast, which is kind of, which has had a very high capacity factor relative to other jurisdictions, and is a real good source of power for it. We expect over the next decade that we will continue to see the growth of onshore and also offshore, and indeed solar. This graphic here shows, for example, solar connecting in the south and east, offshore off the east. But it has to be said, this is illustrative. We believe that there could be upwards of another 10 gigawatts of more renewable generation on top of the approximate 5 gigawatts that we have today. Look, that's a radical change. We're going to really need to change our electricity grid to be able to appropriately accommodate that, so that we can operate a safe, secure, and reliable and economic power system come 2030. The output from a renewable generation, one of the challenges that our renewable generation is, absolutely part of the future, but it does present challenges. So, for example, the output from renewable generation depends on the weather. So, look, obviously, at times we need to be able to make sure we can supply the power to the various consumers when the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining, and so typically as well. Previously, renewable generation has been located at the extremities of our network, and a big challenge for us has been over the last decade is about putting that power from the different corners of the country and bringing it to our major load centres. Next slide, please, Killian. So as part of shaping our electricity future and focusing specifically on the networks element, we wanted to look at, well, how could the grid evolve from where it is today to where it needs to get to by 2030? We're conscious this is a very sensitive question, and we are asking local communities to host electricity infrastructure in the place where they grow up, where they live, and it's important that we go out and seek people's opinions at an early point on how that electricity grid should evolve. So for that end, we came up with four demonstrably different approaches to, I suppose, provoke that debate on how the electricity grid should evolve and help us, I suppose, formulate what would that will look like come this coming autumn. Look, as I mentioned there, and I came up as a question earlier on, like we believe that the final plan will be a blend of the different approaches, perhaps strongly led by one of the approaches. But we would expect, we've had a number of events like this over the last 6 or 7 weeks. Obviously, we'll get full clarity when the consultation responses come in. But look, like we're definitely getting a sense that the kind of a blend of the approaches is what people are looking for. The different approaches, I might briefly give a quick summary and then go through each of them in detail. So in the generation-led approach, that's where we put our generation beside where most of the power is used. So in that particular scenario, we put offshore generation. There's a number of mature projects off the East Coast, put that beside the major load centre, which is Dublin. The simple kind of concepts behind that is if you put your generation beside your demand, look, you're just going to need less connections. Less new changes to the existing grid. The second approach is the developer-led approach. That's the approach, that's the tried and trusted approach that's got us to where we are today. That's where developers decide to locate projects and we build the grid out to them in order to connect them onto the power system. The third approach, and indeed the fourth approach as well, are derivations of the developer-led approach. So the third approach is a technology-led approach, and that's where we look to bring on board new technologies, proven but new technologies in the context of our electricity grid, and look to incorporate that into how we develop the transmission grid. So, for example, in particular, we look at high voltage DC cables, and also looking at the use of power flow controllers. The fourth approach is the demand-led approach. It's pretty much the opposite of the generation-led approach. Instead of looking at bringing your generation to where your demand is, in that particular scenario, we move our demand to where generation is. So take some of that very large energy user growth I mentioned in the Dublin area and move some of that out into the different regions of the country. As I mentioned there, look, we believe that the final answer is going to be a blend of all four of the approaches. I think before I go on to talk about the next slide, I think it's an opportunity maybe to just talk about some of the fundamentals that have emerged to us for all four of the approaches. So first of all, look, at the very heart of what we're going to do, we're going to optimize the existing electricity grid. We're going to minimize the need for new electricity infrastructure insofar as possible. But it is fair to say, to make that step change from where we are today to where we need to get to by 2030, significant network delivery is going to be required. There is no silver bullet here. That's the existing planned projects, and I saw one of the questions in about ATRs. The projects that we need to do to just asset maintain our transmission network, and also the projects that have been identified here as part of shaping our electricity future. New clean flexible generation is going to be required, and that's to handle scenarios that Lee mentioned it there earlier on, that Dunkelflaute scenario, an example where you've got that cold winter's evening, it's after dark, the sun isn't shining, the wind isn't blowing, there's limited flow in interconnectors because the challenges we're facing are being affected, being felt by different jurisdictions. So it's about new clean dispatchable generation is going to be required over the next decade. And look, this analysis is strategic in nature. So we will obviously be talking to local communities and carrying out more detailed assessments on it. Whilst this is programmatic, we will be assessing each project on a project by project basis to make sure that the necessary level of rigor is brought to bear, and also to make sure, absolutely crucially, as we said at the start, that social engagement element of this is really demonstrably brought to bear. And the final point to make is across these four approaches, look, a number of common projects came to the fore for us. There's about 15 common projects in Ireland, and look, in parallel with this consultation, we're already starting to move these through that more detailed technical phase and ultimately on to more public engagement. So it's not that we're waiting for the consultation to end and then we'll move where it makes sense. We're already moving on some projects in the appropriate manner. The next slide, please. So just focusing in on the generation-led approach. Again, that's about moving your generation to where your demand is. The key bullet point there to take account of is the number of projects. So under the generation-led approach, we have about 4.5 gigawatts of offshore wind, effectively pumping it into the Dublin area, and about 1 gigawatt of solar and onshore wind across the rest of the country. That would require around 38 projects. We've carried out a deliverability assessment, taking account of historical look at the build out of projects, looking at the capability of the power system to carry out the necessary outages to actually do the works, very social acceptance for lots of projects in parallel. We believe, and this is a rule of thumb, but around 35 to 45 additional projects are deliverable in the context of 2030. So in this particular scenario, where you move that offshore generation beside your major load centre, your major growth in load in the Dublin area, that results in around 38 projects. And look, we believe that that's broadly or very, very deliverable really by 2030. The next slide, please, Cillian. The next slide is the developer-led approach. And as I mentioned, that's the tried and trusted approach. It's effectively doing what we've done today. And that's really worked well for us over the last decade and indeed a bit beyond that. So like we spoke about it earlier on, maybe in 2010, it was 10 to 15% RESI. We're now up at 43% RESI. That's an absolutely monumental achievement. And this particular approach has delivered that. However, looking out to 2030 and given the scale of new projects and given the scale of taking that approach and looking at, well, what would that look like with the number of new projects that would be required, we believe around 77 projects would be required. And that's based on an onshore approach. So 4 gigawatts from inland wind farms or onshore wind farms, and about 2 gigawatts from solar, and about 2 gigawatts from offshore wind as well. So about 77 projects. Delivering that amount of projects whilst also operating the power system in a safe, secure, reliable, economic manner, we believe it can't be done. And indeed, it wouldn't be possible to do it until many years after 2030. So look, this approach presents us with challenges from an electricity grid perspective. So the next slide. So please, Cillian. So the next slide is where we have what's called the technology-led approach. So we took the developer-led approach where we have that onshore heavy, a lot of onshore wind, solar, and also some offshore wind. We said, okay, how can we make that work? What do we need to do to solve that problem? So we looked at a technology-led approach. So it's again the exact same generation portfolio, and we look to take tried and trusted. And look, we all know as part of this call, the timeline for the development of projects is, it takes time to get through all the different approvals, etc. So it's between 5, 10, and indeed a little bit beyond in certain cases to develop projects. So in the context of 2030, really is only around the corner in all of our worlds. We wanted to look at what are proven technologies that are out there that could be used to help us change the electricity grid. So, for example, we looked at, we have EWIC, we have MOIL already in existence in Ireland and Northern Ireland. For example, EWIC is a 500 HVDC interconnector between Dublin and Liverpool. We thought, well, okay, what happens if we use that technology in a different way? So, for example, there, if you take up in Donegal, in this particular scenario, a lot of onshore wind in the Donegal area. Here, this HVDC, we call it like a kind of a hub, would hoover up power in the vicinity of the one end of the HVDC cable, and then hoover it up and then transport it in bulk down to the major load centres. It's expensive, it's complex, it's not normally done in this way, but it certainly is, it is certainly an approach that really deserved a detailed look at. We also looked at using devices to help kind of, some people call them smart devices, ways of manipulating the flows on the power system so that we can kind of work around bottlenecks on the network. So they're called power flow controllers. So in this particular scenario, we need about 46 projects. Challenging, the projects themselves, particularly HVDC cables, they're difficult, they take a long, they're complex projects, but look, it's challenging in the context of 2030, but certainly 46 is a lot better than 77 for the previous approach. The next slide, please, Killian. And the fourth approach we looked at is the demand-led approach. And here it's, as I mentioned, it's the opposite of the generation-led approach. That's where you take that large demand growth in the Dublin area and look at the scenario, well, what happens if some of that located in the in kind of the regions where there's high amounts of renewables. So we looked at moving 600 megawatts of power to across Letterkenny, Sligo, Galway, Limerick, Cork and Waterford. So about 600 megawatts in total. And that had a very significant impact. So again, that's the onshore heavy approach here. So we require around 41 projects. And look, we believe that this is, will be broadly deliverable by 2030, but it does require the large energy users as well to look to move out of the Dublin area. But again, it's the opposite of the first approach. If you're moving your generation to where your demand is, look, it's incumbent upon us to look at moving the demand to where the generation is. Next slide, please. In our consultation documentation, now I've taken a screenshot here from the detailed technical document that we have out there as part of the consultation. And just to remind you, we actually have 5 different documents across EirGrid and Sony, and that reflects the fact that it's important to talk to different constituents. So we have a plain English summary to those of us that wouldn't be familiar with the jargon of our industry. We also have more technical summaries to speak to audiences that have a really live and breathe this particular industry, which by its nature is complex. So in that context, we took the 4 different approaches and we assessed them in detail against 5 different criteria. We used a multi-criteria analysis approach because it's important. There's no one lens that you can look at as part of this. It's important to look at it through a number of lenses. This is based on how we look to bring projects through our grid development framework. So here we spoke it out by generation-led, developer-led, technology-led, and demand-led, and the 5 different criteria. Look, historically, we would have put a lot of focus on the technical performance and the economics, and absolutely very, very important. What is really, really important, and I was speaking at an event there around the Youth Council of Ireland last night, that environmental space needs to be carefully looked at. That deliverability space as well needs to be very carefully looked at, because at the end of the day, 2030 isn't that far away, and it's really important that we're starting to think about the end date and working back from there and not doing it the other way. And I think the last criteria to touch on is society and acceptability. Look, that's an absolutely key criteria. At the end of the day, we have a lot of technical challenges that we need to overcome. We have a lot of markets, operations, the planning of the electricity network, but that the challenge for both ourselves and indeed all future electricity infrastructure is that social and society acceptance as well. So look, we've looked at it through 5 different criteria. Indeed, the reports look at it as well to a lesser extent against other criteria as well. But look, it's important to take that balanced approach to what is a complex question, and to take that kind of really comprehensive view of it. So that's what our report goes through. The next slide, please. Look, they're open for consultation at the moment. Look, we're looking to get your feedback as part of it, and I can see in some of the questions already this morning. Look, we can get that. We're getting a real strong sense of the different perspectives that we need to consider as we look to finalise our plan. We're looking to have it done around September, October time. So close the consultation in June, consider it and analyse it over the summer months. And look, to be honest with you as well, the feedback we were getting thus far through the consultation period as well is really helpful from our perspective. The next slide, again, like what Owen and Jonna would have shown there previously, this talks about the draft roadmap for networks out to 2030. A slight typo there, but look, this is an illustrative roadmap for networks, but we believe around 9-10 projects need to be kind of moving through that transmission life cycle over the next decade, and we need to be bringing around 9-10 projects per annum through. Because, as I mentioned, this is a programmatic assessment we're doing in shaping. That will be then, we'll be looking at it in more detail on a project by project basis and engaging with the communities in the affected localities to make sure that we develop the right answer. Then obviously, look, like other folks on this call here today, consents, construction, energization as well. This is an illustrative roadmap, but it does, I think, give a quick sense that there's a huge amount of work required over the next decade, and right now we need to start moving on projects so that we can deliver it. I think that's the last slide for myself. Killian, is there any more slides? Yeah, so look, thanks very much for taking the time this morning. Look, I'm happy to hand over to yourself for any questions.
Yeah, thanks a million, Robbie. Really comprehensive. Just the first question, and I think you touched on it inside in your presentation, but it's coming from Ciara McNamara, and it's been with us for a while because we knew we'd be answering it this session. Can you clarify how the current ATR list of projects are included in the consultation approach?
Yeah, so thanks very much. It's a good question, actually, and I made a quick phone call as well. Look, the ATR projects, they are included in the Shaping Our Electricity Future approach. So, for example, I haven't gone through it in detail myself, but effectively that is the starting point. And then based on scenarios that I mentioned there a number of minutes ago, basically what other projects need to be done on top of that so that we can operate our power system in a safe, secure, and reliable manner.
Yeah. Thanks, Robbie. Just, it's a question for Owen and then over to yourself, Robbie. And it comes in from Bernice Doyle. And it's in relation to the modeling assumptions on the transmission network versus system operator piece. And Bernice is highlighting there appears to be a difference between the SysFlex 70% scenario used to define the technical scarcities for system operation and in tomorrow's energy scenario. And the key question is does that present a problem for modeling the gap in relation to the operations or the network side? Is there a disconnect?
So I think this kind of relates to a question that was supposed to be earlier as well, Liam, around the operational side of things, and really what we've been looking at is the SysFlex modeling, other modeling we've done, looking at those snapshots of very high SNSP where we've relaxed a lot of the operational constraints. and that's really what we've been trying to do, is assess those technical challenges. And they've been very similar across all of the scenarios we've looked at. There are, of course, as I said earlier, locational elements to that. But yeah, so from an operational perspective, I think it's we're confident we're seeing the challenges that we might expect to see as you take off a lot of the synchronous generation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, Al.
Yeah, like I think look, there's all of it is coming out of the same pot, so to speak. So look, if there are any slight changes like that, we can look at that again in more detail as part of the final solution. But I wouldn't expect that they'd be material. But look, we'll look at that.
And just a question in from Tony Sheridan, and it's been with us for a while. Just great strides in wind, but what is the equivalent current and target penetration figures for solar?
So in the different approaches, so I don't have the exact figures to hand, but under approach 1 was the generation-led approach. I think it was about 1 gigawatt across wind and solar in Ireland, as well as offshore. And then under approach 2, 3, and 4, which we looked at 2 gigawatts of additional solar in Ireland. So look, obviously, these are forecasts. It depends on the outcome of auctions. We've seen the results from the recent RES auctions, RES 1, for example, where look, there was upwards of 800 megawatts of solar. So look, we believe solar has a really important role to play out into the next decade. And it kind of goes back to that point I was making there earlier on around that kind of what's it going to look like into the future. It's a basket really, and it's about I think it's going to be a blend of the approaches we spoke about earlier on. But absolutely, look, solar clearly has an important role to play out the decade.
Brilliant. Thanks, Robbie. Just a question just came in advance, and it was from Mars Connect. What level of interconnection does EirGrid consider necessary for 2030?
Yeah. So from a networks perspective, we've assumed that we obviously EWIC and Moyle are there at the moment, Greenlink and EWIC and also the North-South interconnector, if you want to put that in the same category, are all operational by 2030. It's all based on tomorrow's energy scenarios, where we would have gone out and consulted with members of our community, but that's rather than a kind of a what further interconnection do we need by 2030, the basis of the analysis that we've done has assumed that trajectory for new interconnection.
Okay. And just moving on, and Robbie, again, it's a question coming in just in relation to with respect to the demand led, do we see the proposing zoning requirements of data centers associated with grid zones?
I think, look, the demand-led approach, obviously, one of the kind of inherent assumptions in it is that demand moves from the Dublin area out into the different regions. Obviously, that's not within EirGrid's control to mandate that. But I think it was important that we look at that particular scenario, because in some ways it was an obvious scenario to look at, and it does illustrate the benefit of that regional approach, which is reflective of governmental policy, a white paper there from a number of years ago. And it just clearly, from an electricity grid perspective, and look, there's lots of other benefits as well associated with it. And when we've gone out and spoken to, for example, the different chambers, this has been an area that they very much focused on. So look, I think what it clearly demonstrates is the benefit to the electricity grid of moving your demand out to adjacent to where your renewable generation is.
And just Robbie, it's a question coming in from Donald Smith. What has RID project process taught EirGrid, and how it is reflected in the solutions and programs in the consultation?
Yeah, so in one of the scenarios, if memory serves me correct, we talk about, or if not maybe two of the scenarios, we talk about significant interconnection or links between the Northwest Ireland and Northern Ireland. The RID project, look, that's a project that we look at in shaping. I think what's going to be key to the future of the RID project is looking at what is what generation comes to fruition in the northwest area, and then determine, well, what approach do we need to take to strengthen the grid up in the northwest? Because absolutely, in that onshore heavy approach, again, taking the pipeline from the TES, and again, this is borne out in RES 1, for example. There's an awful lot of new generation looking to connect up in the Donegal and northwest area, and look, they're like that's a really important role to play. That's a space that we need to give further careful consideration to. Should be noted as well under shaping. We don't look at all the criteria of the transmission planning standards. We only look at the what's called N-1 criteria. So we assume one item of plant faults. The reason for that is that involved about 20 to 30 million studies to actually put together shaping. To look at N-1 that's another order of magnitude. So look, that's something we will have to look at a later point when we start to look at each of the different projects on a more detailed basis.
Thanks, Robbie.
I think though maybe the second part of the question is what can we learn from RIDA? I think, look, our EirGrid have learned a lot over the last decade around engagement, and that's something we've put a lot of work into to really stand back and look at how we're engaging on not just projects like RIDA, but indeed all of our projects. And that's really one of the outcomes is that is shaping our electricity future. So it's about going out there and engaging with communities at a very, very early stage to try and get that first step. How do things need to evolve over a decade so we can step off at the start on that journey with having sought people's feedback at a national level on how things could evolve, and then getting into the detail and engaging with projects. And I think another thing we've learned is the importance of engagement. So we're talking here, obviously industry is a really important part to play as part of shaping, but it's a very important voice, but there are other voices too. So for example, there last night was a great session there with the Youth Council of Ireland. We've been talking to different regional parts of our through Irish Rural Link, the different regions, local communities. We're also going to talk to we're going to do a deliberative assembly to kind of modelled on the citizens' assembly that has been so successfully trialled in Ireland over the last decade, where we go out, take 100 random people and ask them their view of how things evolve. So look, it's important that as a company, we're continuing to look at what we're doing, see what worked well, see what we can do better, and look, it's important that we strive to make those changes because we have a big challenge ahead of us over the next decade. And to be honest with you as well, that partnership that Lee mentioned at the start, that's really, really, really important. EirGrid has an important role to play, but we're a cog in the machine. We're far from the only cog in the machine.
Yeah, no, it's true, Robbie, and just I think it's a well done from John McGuckin in relation to consultation. So well done, folks. And the question coming in from John is that he agrees that social acceptance of more significant grid upgrades are hugely important. And he's asking the panel, have you any ideas of how the industry and policymakers may help support the TSOs on delivering these projects? So, Owen, do you want to go first and then over to Robbie and then on to John?
I don't think I caught that, William, sorry.
Yeah, so it's just how the industry and policymakers may help support the TSO on delivering the projects, because there's a large program of work in front of us, both on the operations, the market, and the network side of the house. So if we're looking across all of those, it's what help and what support would we welcome?
Yeah, I think from a grid perspective, it's that vocal support, and it's that rowing in behind the benefits of grid infrastructure to delivering that overall vision of increased renewable generation across this, sort of meeting the policy objective. It's I suppose supporting EirGrid during those difficult discussions.
Yeah.
Okay.
I agree with what Owen said there, Liam. I think it's really important that it's that there's that in some ways that the industry comes up in a line when the difficult conversations start to happen. And I think that's really important. I think from a policy perspective as well, I think there is great policy clarity in Ireland, and I think that's really important as well, that that's maintained, and that there's, to John's point earlier on, that there's certainty and kind of stableness on the trajectory for going forward. That gives that supports us as a company, but I think it's the industry, to be honest with you, as well at large. I think as well, look at sometimes I think most people on the call would be, we're like very committed to delivering on that transformation over the next decade. I think we agree with 90% of it. Maybe there's that 10% we sometimes have really robust debates on, and that's really good. But I think it's important as well that, look, when there's difficult projects coming up, that as an industry, we come up and support each other.
Yeah. Just a question in for Owen. It's from Bobby Smith, and it's quite long. We're just going to get to the essence. Does EirGrid plan to start to measure and report on CO2 emissions for constrained versus unconstrained runs?
So at the moment, there's, to the best of my knowledge, no plan to do that. I can take it away, I suppose, but I can't commit to anything at this point.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting suggestion.
No, and it's a really good addition. Like, so it's something that this is part of the consultation, that we're out there to get these nuggets and potentially can get us to a better answer. So look, really good question. Okay, just working through the next one. Robbie, you mentioned 30 to 40 projects as credible for 2030. What is the limiting factor? Is it cost or social acceptance? If time is a factor too, when there is a risk that we don't make a start on projects that will need to be on. So in essence, it's going, is it time, is it money, or is it social acceptance? And then for some projects, do we need to start them earlier?
Yeah, look, I totally agree. The time for action is now, and that's why one of the criteria we have under shaping is deliverability, and very much looked at taking 2030 and working backwards, because if we do it the other way, we won't hit 2030. It won't be there. So it's really important to take that change in mindset. Really, what was the first part of the question there, Liam? It was the 35 to 40.
Yeah.
So that's, look, it's 35. I'm going to say 35 to 45 projects, Bobby. It's a rule of thumb. It's not all projects are the same. An uprate, while it can be challenging, is not the same as a new circuit. So that's but a rule of thumb. I think we use the analogy here. Look, we're flying a jumbo jet here. We have to make sure that the jumbo jet stays in the sky, and at the same time we have to fly out onto the wings and fix two of the engines. And that's what we're trying to do here. We have to continue to operate our power system in a safe, secure, reliable, and economic manner. And at the same time, we have to overhaul it as well. So that's one of the factors that limits the amount of work that you can do. Cost, look, obviously all our projects need to be robustly costed, but look, we're working to deliver government policy. So I think that the ability to continue to operate the power system is a really important factor, and that's the social engagement as well. You mentioned it. Look, I think there's an appetite. There's only so much of an appetite out there from the general public for works, and that's something that we have to be conscious of as well. But look, there's no one answer for it. That approach there is based on a historical look back. It's not an exact science, and we're very aware of that, and that's why we've put a range around it.
And just a question coming in from StatCraft, probably for yourself, Robbie, is the lack of particular focus on the consultation on the development needs of the Midlands from a network perspective.
Okay, so as I would have mentioned there, we would have based our analysis here on our tomorrow's energy scenarios, and let's get a drink of water. Sorry, 1 second. We would have based our scenarios on tomorrow's energy scenarios, which in turn would have been subject to detailed engagement. So that was the starting point for our analysis, and we were keen to do that because we wanted to remain objective and independent. And to be honest with you, we had to take those scenarios and change them somewhat to reflect further clarity around government targets as well. It has to be said. Look, we're looking for feedback as part of tomorrow's energy scenarios around how generation portfolios will evolve. We've already carried out a detailed assessment of RES 1 and what other projects could be successful in future energy auctions. So look, we're not locked into any particular generation portfolio by any manner or means. We're looking for feedback. We're obviously going to keep an eye on it and then modify our plan or to come up with the plan for the autumn. And it has to be said as well, when we do shaping and I suppose issue version 1.0 at the end of this year, we're going to have to iterate on that. And we're not these aren't, again, it's not an exact science. There's an awful lot of moving parts here. Things can move very quickly. So we would envisage on a regular basis, maybe it's annual, maybe it's more than annual as well, to reflect a significant change in policy or a major development in the commercial viability of a particular approach that we will need to iterate on this roadmap to make sure that it reflects reality.
Thanks a million, Robbie. Just in relation to there's loads of questions come in. Owen, when is the Q2 study on system services expected to be published? Is it May or June?
Yeah, targeting the end of June, and just to manage expectations on what it'll cover. It's really focused predominantly around the stability related areas, and it's setting out different ways that you can I suppose help to mitigate those technical challenges. It's not necessarily saying that this is the optimal way of doing it at this point, but yeah, the end of June is what we're targeting, Liam.
Okay, thanks, Alan. Just a question coming in relation to the optimal use of infrastructure. To make optimal use of existing infrastructure, will sharing of MECs between multiple SPVs, e.g. wind farms and solar farms behind a connection point be facilitated, and what are the major challenges to achieve this?
I'm guessing that's hybrid connections. Look, that's I might hand over to maybe Owen or John. I think that's a space we're looking at, but maybe you might have further clarity on where we are.
Yeah, I can certainly come in from it. In principle, yes, we are looking at how you can do that. I think there's a concept we have sort of saying portfolio arrangements. How better can you use the existing network and also service provision? It's a combination of the two. And how MEC, MIC is utilised on the transmission network is very relevant in that. I think the big challenge is once you go to a situation where you're giving out more capacity than you actually classically would have had. So you connect, say, 200 megawatt generators behind a connection that is only built for one of them, right? But you're trying to share it. You have to have an operational metric that if the generators or the demand, if it could be, isn't behaving, that we can still make the network secure. So there's operational considerations, and if you go to the full portfolio arrangement, it's multiple sites. They all have individual connection rights, but they're trying to share that in some way. So there's an operational issue, and then there's actually a commercial issue, which is what actually is the property right we're giving somebody if we're giving them a connection shared with somebody else in some fashion. And it goes back to investor certainty without clarifying. And remember, I was talking about standards or rules or laws as well as incentives. One of the standards is what's the nature of the property right that we've afforded somebody on the transmission network with respect to those issues. And so I would say there's a legal thing, there's an operational and incentives thinking in that space. But I think
Sorry, John.
I might just, I think we lost John there, Liam, but just I might add just something to that, which is, a couple of months ago, ESB Networks and EirGrid jointly held a consultation looking for stakeholder perspectives on potential contractual options for multiple legal entities sharing a single connection point. And that's a piece that we've been working very closely on over the last while, and we expect to issue a response to that consultation very shortly.
And Just the final question, which you'll be happy to hear, guys, because you've been answering loads of questions today. So just in relation to post 23, what's your views in relation to shaping?
Post 2030.
Yeah, sorry, post
Yeah.
2030, apologies.
Yeah. Look, I think this is a really important step that we have to take. We have to get a clear picture of how things are going to evolve out to 2030 from electricity markets, system operation and networks perspective. But look, it's only a step on the journey. More needs to be done over the coming decades, and there's great work being done as well by the wider industry that are looking at kind of what is the future evolution of the power system going to look like, and that's certainly in EirGrid's plans to do that. But right now our focus is on shaping, but we need to make sure that while we solve the problems of tomorrow, we're also keeping an eye on the future, and that has to be implicit in what we're doing for shaping.
Thanks, Robbie. Thanks, Owen, and thanks, John. I think well, I'm just going to call this session to a close, and then I'm just going to wrap up. So to thank the three of you for taking all the time to take us through the slides today, but in also for answering all the questions coming in. And I also want to thank all the people for putting in the questions, because without yourselves, the session wouldn't have been as lively as what it was. So to really thank you for that, folks. So look, as we actually conclude, I just want to thank everybody in relation to taking the time today. And as you can see, there's a huge amount of work in front of us as an industry. And I've no fear that we won't achieve it. Like we have delivered the 40% renewables target. I am fully sure that we will deliver the government's targets into the future as well, the 70% targeted, and that we will do it as we always do. I think one of the challenges that we actually have, and I think it was called out through the presentations, is the social acceptance and winning the hearts and minds of the of society. Because as we actually build out the infrastructure and as we actually do what we need to do, it's going to be a real challenge for us. In addition, it's making sure that we have the right investment signals so that the market is fit for purpose, so that we actually have a system that people can actually invest into and that we can deliver into the future. And therefore it sets us up for the right technologies for 2030 and for beyond 2030, as was a few of the questions were highlighting there as we went through it. And then the final thing is we need to change how we operate the market, how we actually operate the power system. It is going to be very different than what we have done before, operating up at 95% to 100% SNSP. Nobody in the world is even thinking about that levels at this point in time. As Owen actually said, we're very heavily involved with the Global Power System Transformation Group, which launched their roadmap just yesterday. And it is very much like EirGrid have been feeding in very heavily into it, as has Sony. And we actually have been making sure that in industry forums like this help us get the right influence into those forums and those items that we actually have. So look, we have a huge amount of work in front of us. I've no doubt that we will achieve it as we all working collaboratively together to get us through it. And EirGrid can't do it on our own. And I think, as a few of the questions highlighted today, that we need support, we need help in relation to doing this. And I think it's really having that commitment that we collectively and collaboratively work together to make the right decisions that allow us to shape the electricity into the future. And key to that is that we want to hear your voice. So my last comment on this is that we would please urge you to take the time to submit your views onto the consultation, because that's going to be really important for how we get to the final roadmap and how we actually deliver the final solutions that we'll be working, that will set us on a trajectory for the next 10 years or so. And again, I want to finally thank again all the presenters today, and again to thank all the audience for your real positive and constructive interaction all day, and then also the really good questions that you sent into the panel. And as I said, I believe that we will achieve this as we've always done, as a collective, working very closely together. And on that note, I just want to close the session and to thank everybody for your time today. I really do appreciate it, folks. Thank you very much.